The wind screamed across the northern ridge like something alive, and Alara Voss could no longer feel her hands. She had been running for 3 hours, maybe 4. Time had stopped meaning anything the moment she crossed the border stone and left the only home she had ever known behind her. Her boots had frozen through an hour ago. Her lungs burned with every breath of ice-cold air. Somewhere behind her, through the blinding white curtain of the storm, she could still hear them. Voices, footsteps, the low growl of wolves who were not chasing an enemy. They were chasing her. She stumbled over a buried root and fell hard into a drift of snow, and for a moment she simply lay there, staring up at a sky the color of ash. "Get up," she told herself. "If you stop now, you die here." But her body did not listen. Her legs had gone numb from the knee down, and the cold had stopped feeling like cold. It felt like sleep. 3 days ago, she had been the daughter of a respected Frostfang bloodline, trusted enough to sit in on council meetings, trained enough to hold her own in the training ring. 2 days ago, she had been accused of a crime so unthinkable that the pack elders had not even waited for a full hearing before condemning her. Someone had tried to kill the Frostfang Alpha in his sleep, and every piece of evidence, planted with careful precision, pointed to her. She had not done it. She would have said so to anyone who asked, but no one had asked. They had simply come for her in the night, and she had run, because the alternative was execution before sunrise. Now, buried in snow on land that did not belong to her pack, she understood that running had only bought her a slower death. The howls grew closer. She forced her eyes open and pushed herself up onto one elbow, her whole body trembling with the effort. Ahead of her, through the storm, she could make out the shape of trees, tall and black against the white. If she could reach them, she could hide. It was not a good plan. It was the only plan she had left. She dragged herself forward on hands and knees, snow soaking through what remained of her clothes, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a small, calm voice told her that this was probably how it would end. Not in a trial, not in a fair fight, just here, in the snow, alone, with no one left who believed her. Her vision blurred. The trees seemed to tilt sideways. She reached out one more time, fingers closing on nothing but cold air, and then the world went dark. Damien Ashford had not wanted to be out on the ridge that night. As Alpha King of the Blackthorn Pack, he had 100 better things to do than personally walk the northern border during the worst storm the territory had seen in a decade. His beta, Kieran Voss, no relation to the girl freezing half a mile away, though fate has a strange sense of humor, had told him as much before he left the estate. "Send the border patrol," Kieran had said. "That's what they're for." The border patrol reported movement an hour ago, and then went silent, Damien had answered, already pulling on his coat. "I'm not sending more men into a blackout without knowing what's out there." That was the kind of alpha Damien was. He did not send others where he was unwilling to go himself. It was part of why the Blackthorn Pack had thrived under his rule for the better part of 6 years, ever since he had taken the crown from his father at the unusually young age of 24. He was not reckless. He was careful, deliberate, and utterly unwilling to ask his people for anything he was not prepared to do himself. The storm had gotten worse since he left the estate. Visibility was down to almost nothing, snow driving sideways in the wind, and even with a wolf's heightened senses, he was having trouble tracking anything through the noise of the blizzard. He had shifted twice already, once on 2 legs to check radio contact with his patrol teams, once on 4 to move faster through the drifts. Now he moved on 4 paws again, nose low, searching for any scent that did not belong. That was when he found it. It was faint, nearly buried under the storm, but unmistakable. A scent that hit something deep and ancient inside him, something that had nothing to do with duty, or border patrols or missing men. It struck him like a physical blow, and for one disorienting second, his wolf simply stopped moving. "Mate." He had heard other wolves describe the moment. He had never quite believed the stories. Not fully. Not until this exact second, when the entire world seemed to narrow down to a single thread of scent, cutting through ice and snow. Every instinct in him, wolf and man both, screamed at him to follow it. He ran. The scent grew stronger as he crested a low rise and dropped into a shallow valley lined with black pine trees. And there, half buried in a drift of snow at the base of the tree line, was a shape that did not belong to the landscape. A person, small, still, and far too pale. He shifted back to 2 legs the moment he reached her, ignoring the biting cold against his own skin, and dropped to his knees beside her. "Hey," he said, voice sharp with urgency. "Hey, can you hear me?" She did not answer. Her lips had gone faintly blue, and her breathing was so shallow he had to lean close just to confirm it was happening at all. He pressed 2 fingers to her throat and found a pulse, weak and slow, but there. Every rational part of his mind told him this was not his problem. He did not know who this girl was. She was not Pac, not even close, judging by the unfamiliar layers of her scent beneath the mate bond pull. Taking in a stranger during a border security crisis was not what a careful alpha did. But the wolf inside him did not care about rational. The wolf had already decided, the moment her scent hit him, that this girl was his, and nothing in the world was going to convince him to leave her here, to die in the snow. He pulled off his coat and wrapped it around her, then lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, which worried him more than it should have. Whatever had happened to her before she ended up on his territory, it had not been kind. "Stay with me," he murmured, more to himself than to her, and began the long run back toward the estate. The wind fought him the entire way, throwing snow into his eyes, trying to slow him down, but he pushed through it with a strength he did not entirely recognize as his own. It was the bond, he realized. It was already working on him, sharpening his focus, burning away his exhaustion, replacing it with a single, overriding need to get her somewhere warm before it was too late. By the time the lights of the Blackthorn estate came into view through the storm, his arms had gone numb from carrying her, and his lungs felt scraped raw from the cold air. He did not slow down. He crossed the last stretch of open ground at a dead run and shouldered through the heavy front doors, snow scattering across the polished floor of the entrance hall. "Get the healer," he shouted, and the 2 guards stationed near the door startled into motion, one of them sprinting off down the hallway, while the other rushed to help clear a path. Kieran appeared at the top of the staircase, already half-dressed for bed, and stopped dead at the sight of his alpha standing in the entrance hall, soaked and freezing, cradling an unconscious stranger in his arms. "Damien, what happened? Who is that?" "I don't know yet," Damien said, already moving toward the stairs, "but I'm not losing her." He carried her up to his own private chambers, rather than the guest wing, a decision he made without fully thinking it through, driven entirely by instinct. Something in him needed her close, needed to be able to see her breathing with his own eyes, rather than trust a report from someone else. He laid her gently on the bed and stepped back, only far enough to let the healer, an older woman named Odalis, who had served the pack for longer than Damien had been alive, get to work. Odalis pressed her hands to the girl's forehead, then her wrist, murmuring under her breath as she checked for injuries beneath the layers of frozen clothing. "Severe cold exposure," she said after a moment. "She's been out there for hours. Whoever she is, she's lucky you found her when you did. Another 20 minutes and there would have been nothing I could do." "Will she wake up?" Damien asked. He was standing near the foot of the bed, arms crossed, jaw tight in a way that betrayed far more concern than he probably wanted to show in front of his healer and his beta. "She should. Her body is fighting hard to warm itself, young, strong, healthy under all this cold. Whatever brought her out into that storm, it wasn't sickness that nearly killed her. It was exposure. Someone left her out there, or she was running from something." Damien's jaw tightened further at that. Running from something. He filed the thought away, along with 100 other questions crowding his mind, and forced himself to focus on the more immediate problem, which was getting her warm and stable before anything else could be figured out. It was Kieran who noticed the mark first. As Odalis worked to wrap the girl's hands, gently peeling back the sleeve of her ruined coat, a symbol became visible on the inside of her wrist. Pale, silvery, unmistakable to anyone who had spent time studying pack lineage marks. Kieran went very still. "Damien," he said quietly, "you need to see this." Damien crossed the room in 3 strides and looked down at the mark on her wrist. It took him only a second to recognize it, because every wolf in the Blackthorn pack had been raised knowing the symbols of their rivals, the same way soldiers memorized the flags of enemy nations. The Frostfang crest. For a long moment, nobody in the room said anything. The fire crackled in the hearth. The wind howled outside the windows. And Damien Ashford, Alpha King of the Blackthorn pack, stood staring down at the unconscious girl in his bed, understanding with sudden and terrible clarity exactly what he had just carried into his own home. "She's Frostfang," Kieran said, unnecessary but needing to be said aloud all the same. "Damien, if the elders find out you brought a Frostfang wolf into your own private chambers, I know what they'll say." Damien did not look away from her. His voice was low, controlled, but there was something underneath it, something rougher, something that had nothing to do with politics, and everything to do with the bond still humming beneath his skin, like a second heartbeat. "I know exactly what they'll say." "Then you understand why this is a problem." "I understand it's a problem." Damien finally looked up, meeting his beta's eyes. "I also understand that I've been alpha of this pack for 6 years, and never once has my wolf reacted to anyone the way it reacted to her scent tonight. Do you understand what that means, Kieran?" Kieran's expression shifted, understanding dawning slowly and then all at once. "No," he said quietly. "Tell me that's not what you're saying." "She's my mate." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than anything else in the room. Kieran ran a hand through his hair, pacing a short line beside the bed, clearly trying to think through the implications faster than his mind could keep up. "Damien, the ancient laws are clear about this. A mate bond between rival pack lines during an active territorial conflict. I know the law." "Then you know what it demands: rejection or exile, sometimes worse, depending on how the council chooses to interpret it. You cannot simply keep her here." Damien looked back down at the girl on the bed, at the faint color slowly returning to her lips, at the steady rise and fall of her chest that Odalis had worked so hard to secure. Whatever storm was building outside these walls, political or literal, felt distant compared to the quiet, overwhelming certainty settling into his chest. "I found her dying in the snow," he said finally. "I am not throwing her back out into it because of a law written before either of us was born." "And if the elders demand her removal? Then they will have to demand it to my face." Damien's voice hardened, the tone that Kieran recognized from council meetings, the tone of an alpha who had already made up his mind and would not be moved. "She stays. At least until she wakes up and I understand what actually happened to her out there. After that, we figure out the rest." Kieran did not look convinced, but he also knew better than to argue further tonight. He gave a short nod and stepped back, letting Odalis finish her work in silence. Damien pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, elbows braced on his knees, watching the rise and fall of her breathing, as if it might stop the moment he looked away. Outside, the storm continued to rage against the windows, but inside the room, for the first time since he had caught her scent on the ridge, something in him had gone quiet. He did not know her name. He did not know what she had done, or what had been done to her, or why a Frostfang mark sat on her wrist like a brand that could get them both killed. He knew only that some part of him, deeper than duty and older than politics, had already decided that whatever came next, he was not letting her go. Hours passed, the fire burned low, and somewhere in the depths of exhausted frozen sleep, Elara Voss began, very slowly, to dream. She dreamed of snow, and running, and a voice calling her back from somewhere far away, warm and steady, the first warmth she had felt in what seemed like days. She did not yet know the voice belonged to the one man in the entire Northern Territories who could either save her life a second time, or become the very thing that finally destroyed her. Odalis stayed until the deepest hours of the night, checking the girl's pulse every so often, adjusting the blankets, murmuring small remedies under her breath that smelled of pine and something sweeter, something Damien did not recognize. When she finally stepped back and pressed the back of her hand to the girl's cheek one last time, she gave a small, satisfied nod. "She'll live," Odalis said. "Her body has stopped fighting the cold and started fighting to heal instead. That's the hard part done. The rest is just time." "Thank you," Damien said, and meant it more than the simple words could carry. Odalis studied him for a long moment before she left, the kind of look that suggested she understood far more than she was saying out loud. She had served 3 generations of Ashford Alphas. She had likely seen every kind of crisis a pack could produce, political or personal, and something in her expression told Damien she already suspected exactly what this night meant for him. "Get some rest yourself, Alpha," she said instead of whatever else she might have been thinking. "You carried her half a mile through a blizzard. Even wolves have limits. He did not rest. Long after Odalis had gone, and Kieran had returned downstairs to manage the patrol reports and reassure the guards that their alpha had not lost his mind entirely, Damien remained in the chair beside the bed, watching the girl breathe. He tried, several times, to convince himself to leave the room. There were reports to read, decisions to make about the border breach that had first sent him out into the storm, a dozen small fires that needed his attention before morning. Every time he stood to leave, something in his chest pulled tight, an invisible thread refusing to let him walk more than a few steps toward the door before he found himself turning back. It was not something he could explain to Kieran, or to the elders, or even fully to himself. He had led the Blackthorn pack through territorial disputes, through a harsh winter that had nearly broken the eastern farms, through the death of his father and the weight of a crown he had not expected to wear so young. He had learned, over 6 years, to keep his emotions carefully separate from his decisions, because an alpha who let his heart lead his choices was an alpha who eventually led his people into ruin. And yet here he was, sitting beside a stranger, a Frostfang stranger, unable to leave her side for more than the length of a single breath. Near dawn, her breathing changed. It grew steadier, deeper, the shallow, fragile rasp of before, replaced by something closer to natural sleep. Color had returned fully to her lips and cheeks, and when Damien leaned close to check, he found her skin no longer felt like ice beneath his fingers. She was going to live. Whatever came next, whatever storm the Frostfang mark on her wrist would bring crashing down on both their heads, she was going to live. And for tonight, that was enough. He thought about the men and women of his patrol team who had gone silent on the ridge before he found her, and the uncomfortable question of whether her sudden appearance in his territory and their silence were somehow connected. He thought about the elders and how quickly word would spread once the household staff realized who exactly had been carried into the Alpha's private chambers. He thought about the ancient laws, old rules written by wolves long dead, rules that claimed to know better than a bond that had struck him harder than anything in his entire life. Mostly, though, he simply watched her sleep and let himself, for one quiet hour before the sun rose over the ridge, feel something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. Not the weight of a crown, not the burden of leadership, just the simple, terrifying relief of having reached someone in time. Outside, the storm finally began to break. The wind eased from a scream to a whisper, and the first pale light of morning crept over the eastern hills, catching on the frost-covered windows and scattering thin gold across the floor of the room. Ilara stirred. It was small at first, just a slight shift of her fingers against the blanket, a faint furrow forming between her brows as awareness began, slowly, to return. Damien sat forward immediately, every muscle in his body going alert. "Ilara," he said softly, though he did not yet know that was her name, only guessed at the shape of it from a whisper Odalis had caught earlier in the night, half-delirious words the girl had murmured in her sleep. He tried it again anyway, some instinct telling him it was right. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened. They were pale gray, sharp even through the haze of exhaustion and confusion, and the moment they found his face, something passed between them that neither of them could name. Recognition, though they had never met. Relief, though she did not yet know if she was safe. And beneath both of those, something older and far more powerful, a pull neither of them had asked for, and neither of them could deny. She opened her mouth to speak, and the first word that came out, cracked and barely audible, changed everything that would follow. "Who," she whispered, "are you?" And Damien, staring down at the woman the storm had brought into his life and his territory, and, against every rule his people had ever written, into the deepest part of his chest, understood that answering that question honestly was going to be the most dangerous thing he had ever done. Damien," he said. "Damien Ashford. You're safe. You collapsed in the snow near the northern ridge, and I brought you here." Ilara pushed herself up against the pillows, wincing at the effort, her gray eyes darting around the unfamiliar room. Heavy wooden beams crossed the ceiling above her. A fire burned low in a stone hearth across the room. None of it looked familiar, and none of it felt safe. Not yet. Not until she understood exactly where she was, and who this man standing over her actually was. "Where?" she started, then stopped, her voice catching on the dryness in her throat. Blackthorn territory, Damien said. He reached for a cup of water on the side table and offered it to her carefully, watching her hands shake as she took it. You're at the Pack estate. The cup nearly slipped from her fingers. Blackthorn. Of all the packs in the Northern Territories, of all the places the storm could have driven her, it had to be Blackthorn land. The pack her own people had fought for 3 generations. The pack whose name alone had been used to frighten Frostfang children into obedience since before she was born. You need to let me go, she said quickly, trying to push the blankets away, despite the way her limbs still trembled with cold and exhaustion. I shouldn't be here. If your people find out. They already know, Damien said, not unkindly, but firm enough to stop her mid-motion. My beta saw the mark on your wrist last night. There's no hiding what you are, not in this house. Elara froze, one hand still gripping the edge of the blanket. Her wrist ached where the Frostfang crest had been carved into her skin years ago during a coming-of-age ceremony she had once been proud of, back when her pack still felt like home, instead of a place that had tried to end her life. Then you should have let me freeze, she said quietly. It would have been simpler. Something flickered across Damien's face, a tightness around his eyes, that suggested her words had landed harder than she intended. He sat back down in the chair beside the bed, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him, and studied her, with an intensity that made her want to look away, and impossible to actually do so. I'm not going to pretend I understand what's happening here, he said. You're Frostfang. I'm Blackthorn. Our packs have hated each other longer than either of us has been alive. By every rule I was raised to follow, I should have left you where I found you. Then why didn't you? He hesitated, and in that hesitation, Elara saw something she recognized instantly, because she had felt it too, buried beneath the fear and the cold and the sheer disbelief of waking up in enemy territory. A pull, a recognition that had nothing to do with logic. Because the moment I caught your scent, Damien said slowly, something in me refused to consider any other option. Elara's breath caught. She had heard the old stories, the way every wolf pup in the Frostfang nursery had been told about mates, about the bond that struck without warning, and changed everything it touched. She had never expected to feel it herself, and certainly never expected to feel it toward an alpha king from the one pack her own family had taught her to hate. No, she said, shaking her head, though the word came out weaker than she intended. That's not possible. The bond doesn't cross pack lines like this. It can't. I know the law as well as you do. Damien's voice had gone quiet, careful, as if he were choosing each word with great precision. I know what it means if I'm right about this. But I've never felt anything like what hit me on that ridge last night, and I don't think you have either. Elara said nothing, because he was right, and admitting it out loud felt like stepping off a cliff she could not see the bottom of. She thought of the accusation that had driven her out into the storm in the first place, the poisoned dagger found hidden in her room, the whispered evidence that had turned her own pack against her within a single night. She thought of the trial that never happened, the sentence handed down without a fair hearing, the sound of her own alpha's voice condemning her before she had even been given the chance to speak in her own defense. If word reached Frostfang territory that she had bonded with the Blackthorn Alpha, it would not matter that she was innocent of the first crime. This would be treated as a second betrayal, proof in the eyes of her enemies that she had always intended to run to the rival pack. It would confirm every terrible thing they already believed about her. You don't understand what you're risking, she said finally. Both of us. If this is real, if it's actually a bond, your own elders will demand you reject it. And if my people ever find out, they won't just condemn me for something I didn't do. They'll use this as proof they were right to. Then tell me what actually happened, Damien said. Why were you running? What crime are you supposedly guilty of? Elara's hands tightened around the edge of the blanket. She had not told anyone the full story, not even Odalise, who had asked gentle questions while tending to her injuries the night before, and received only silence in return. Trust did not come easily to her anymore, not after watching people she had known her entire life turn against her without a second thought. But something about the way Damien was watching her, patient, steady, genuinely waiting rather than demanding, made the words feel slightly less impossible to speak. 3 nights ago, she said slowly, someone tried to kill my alpha while he slept. A dagger, poisoned, found hidden beneath his pillow before it could be used. The attempt failed only because a guard changed his rounds early and disturbed whoever placed it there before they could finish. And they blamed you. They found a matching dagger in my room the next morning. My own knife, one I'd owned since I was 12 years old, covered in the same poison used on the one beneath the pillow. I don't know how it got there. I never touched it, never went anywhere near the Alpha's chambers that night. But no one asked how it got there. They only saw the knife and decided that was enough. Damien's jaw tightened, an expression that reminded Alara of her own father in the rare moments he had allowed himself to show anger rather than the careful diplomatic mask he usually wore in council meetings. "Someone framed you," he said. "That's what I've been trying to tell everyone. No one is listening." Her voice cracked slightly, exhaustion and old grief bleeding through the careful control she had been holding on to. "My own Alpha sentenced me to death without a trial. I had maybe an hour's warning before they came for me. I ran because staying meant dying for something I didn't do, and running meant—" She gestured weakly at the room around her, at the situation she now found herself in. Well, this, apparently. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire cracked softly in the hearth. Outside, the last remnants of the storm continued to thin, sunlight breaking through the clouds in pale golden bands. "I believe you," Damien said finally. Alara looked up at him sharply. "You don't know me. You have no reason to believe anything I say." "I have every reason." His voice was quiet, but certain. "You're my mate, whether either of us wanted that or not. And more than that, I've sat across from enough liars in council meetings to know what deception looks like. You're not lying to me." Something in Alara's chest loosened slightly, a tension she had been carrying for 3 days finally easing, even if only a fraction. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling, being believed. She had almost forgotten what it felt like. "That doesn't solve anything," she said, though there was less certainty in her voice now than before. "Even if you believe me, I'm still a fugitive from my own pack, and you're still risking everything by keeping me here. Let me worry about that." "Damien." She said his name for the first time, and something about the sound of it in her own voice, in this room, in this impossible situation, felt strangely significant. "Your council will not simply let this happen. They'll demand you send me away, or worse. They can demand whatever they want." He stood, moving to the window, looking out over the pack grounds now visible beneath the thinning storm clouds. "I've led this pack for 6 years. I've made hard decisions before. I'm not going to start running from them now, especially not this one." A knock sounded at the door before Alara could respond. Kieran entered, without waiting for an answer, his expression tight and urgent in a way that immediately put both of them on alert. "Damien, we have a problem," he said. "The border patrol team that went silent last night. We found them." "And?" Kieran's eyes flicked briefly to Alara before returning to his Alpha. 3 of them are dead. The 4th is alive but barely conscious. Whatever attacked them wasn't a random predator. The wounds are too precise. This was deliberate." The color drained slightly from Alara's face. 3 dead guards, on the same night she had crossed onto Blackthorn territory, in the same storm that had nearly claimed her own life. "You think it's connected to her," Damien said, his voice low. "I think," Kieran said carefully, "that we need to consider every possibility, including the one where she wasn't running from her own pack alone last night, including the one where someone followed her here." Alara's hands began to tremble again, though not from the cold this time. She thought of the Frostfang trackers, the ones sent to hunt down fugitives who fled pack justice, ruthless wolves, trained specifically to eliminate threats before they could become political problems. "If Frostfang trackers followed me onto your land," she said quietly, "they wouldn't have stopped for your patrol. They would have gone through them to reach me." Damien's expression hardened into something cold and dangerous, an expression Kieran clearly recognized, because he took an involuntary step back toward the door. "Then we need to find out exactly what's happening on my border," Damien said, "before whoever did this decides to finish what they started." Outside, the storm had finally cleared, revealing a bright, deceptively calm winter morning. But inside the Blackthorn estate, everyone in that room understood that whatever peace the daylight offered was only temporary, and that the true danger, whether from Frostfang trackers, hidden conspirators, or the ancient laws waiting to punish an impossible bond, had only just begun. Kieran left to organize a search party along the northern ridge, taking a dozen of the pack's most experienced trackers with him. Damien remained behind only long enough to make sure Alara had everything she needed: food, warm clothing borrowed from the household stores, and a promise that guards would be posted outside the door, not to keep her contained, he was careful to explain, but to keep her safe, until they understood the full scope of the threat. "I don't need protecting," Alara said, though the words carried less conviction than she intended. She had spent the last 3 days protecting herself, running, hiding, surviving on instinct alone, and the idea of leaning on someone else, especially someone from a pack she had been raised to distrust, felt deeply unfamiliar. "I know you don't," Damien said, "but you're going to let me do it anyway, at least until we know who killed 3 of my guards last night." She did not argue further, mostly because she understood, somewhere beneath her pride, that he was right. Whatever strength had carried her across the border and through the storm had been spent entirely getting her this far. She had nothing left to fight with, not physically, and pretending otherwise would only get someone else hurt. After Damien left to join the search efforts himself, Odalise returned with a tray of food, simple bread and broth, and settled into the chair beside the bed, with the unhurried patience of someone who had tended to far more complicated situations than a mysterious Frostfang guest. "Eat," Odalise said, setting the tray down. "You'll need your strength, whatever happens next." Alara accepted the broth gratefully, surprised by how hungry she actually was once the smell reached her. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke, the quiet crackle of the fire the only sound in the room. "You don't seem surprised," Alara said eventually, glancing at the older woman. "About any of this. The mark, the bond, and Alpha bringing home an enemy wolf." Odalise smiled faintly, the kind of smile that suggested decades of watching pack politics rise and fall like tides. "I've served 3 Ashford Alphas, child. I've seen wars start over less than what happened last night, and I've seen peace built on stranger foundations than a storm-born bond. Surprise is a young woman's luxury. I stopped being surprised by fate a long time ago." "Do you think it's really true?" "The bond, I mean. That it could actually cross pack lines like this?" "I think," Odalise said, choosing her words carefully, "that the old laws were written by wolves who wanted control more than they wanted truth. Fate doesn't ask permission from council elders. It never has." She studied Alara for a long moment, something gentle and assessing in her gaze. "Whatever happens next, you should know that Damien Ashford is not a man who makes decisions lightly. If he's chosen to protect you, it's because some part of him already believes you're worth protecting. That's not nothing, coming from him." Alara said nothing, but she turned the words over carefully in her mind, long after Odalise had gathered the empty tray and left the room. Alone, the quiet pressed in around her, and for the first time since the storm, she allowed herself to think clearly about everything that had happened. 3 days ago she had believed in her pack, in its laws, in the fairness of a system she had been raised to trust completely. Now she was lying in the bed of an enemy Alpha, marked as a fugitive, hunted possibly by her own people, and bound by something ancient and undeniable, to a man she had known for less than a single day. None of it made sense, and yet somehow, lying there in the borrowed warmth of Blackthorn territory, it felt more honest than anything her own pack had offered her in the final days before she fled. She thought of her father, a respected council member who had likely voted for her sentence without hesitation, or perhaps had been too afraid to vote against it. She thought of the friends who had once trained beside her in the sparring ring, none of whom had spoken a single word in her defense when the accusations were made. She thought of the real culprit, still walking free within Frostfang territory, watching from the shadows as she took the blame for a crime that would have collapsed their entire pack leadership if it had succeeded. Someone wanted the Frostfang Alpha dead badly enough to frame an innocent woman for the attempt. That meant someone within her own pack was playing a much longer, much more dangerous game than anyone realized, and until that person was found, Alara would remain the perfect scapegoat, easy to blame, easy to discard, easy to hunt down and silence for good, if she ever tried to return and clear her name. The thought settled over her with cold, uncomfortable clarity. She was not simply running from an unjust sentence anymore. She was standing, whether she wanted to be there or not, directly in the path of whoever had orchestrated the attack in the first place, and if that person learned she had survived the storm, and found shelter within Blackthorn territory, they would not simply let the matter rest. They would come looking for her, and this time, they would not fail. Outside, the sound of distant howls drifted across the estate grounds, Kieran's search party moving methodically along the ridge where the guards had fallen. Alara pulled the blankets tighter around her shoulders and stared at the ceiling, listening to the fading calls, wondering how many more nights like this one lay ahead before the truth, whatever it turned out to be, finally came to light. The search party found the attack site just after midday, and what they discovered raised more questions than answers. Kieran crouched beside a patch of disturbed snow near the edge of the ridge, examining the ground with the careful eye of someone who had tracked enemies through worse terrain than this. The scene told a brutal story. Claw marks gouged deep into the frozen earth, broken branches scattered across a wide radius, and blood, dark against the white snow, far more than 3 wounded men should have left behind. "These aren't ordinary tracks," said Owen, one of the pack's senior trackers, kneeling beside a print half buried under fresh snowfall. "Look at the size, look at the depth. Whatever did this was moving fast, and it was strong." Damien crouched beside him, studying the print with narrowed eyes. It was a wolf print, unmistakably, but larger than any pack member he had ever seen, and the spacing between prints suggested a speed that bordered on impossible for a natural predator. "Frostfang trackers are trained for stealth, not this," Kieran said, straightening up. "This looks less like an assassination and more like a slaughter. Which means, whoever did this either didn't care about being subtle," Damien said slowly, "or wanted to send a message." They spent the next several hours combing the area, and the picture that emerged was grim. 3 guards had died fighting, their wounds consistent with a coordinated attack from multiple assailants working in tandem. The 4th guard, found alive but barely conscious, nearly a quarter-mile from the initial attack site, had crawled that entire distance with a shattered leg, driven by nothing but sheer will to survive and report what he had seen. They carried him back to the estate immediately, and Odalise worked through the afternoon to stabilize him, the household staff moving in hushed, anxious circles as word of the attack spread through every corner of the estate. By early evening, the guard, a young wolf named Callum who had only recently completed his training, was stable enough to speak, though his voice remained weak and his hands trembled as he recounted what happened. "There were at least 6 of them," Callum said, propped up against a mountain of pillows in the healer's quarters, Damien and Kieran standing on either side of his bed. "Maybe more. They came out of the storm without warning. We never even had time to sound an alarm." "Did you see their markings?" Damien asked. "Any identifying features?" Callum hesitated, his eyes flicking briefly toward the door, as if checking that no one else could overhear. "Frostfang," he said finally. "I saw the crest on at least 2 of them before everything went dark. But Alpha, something about it felt wrong." "Wrong how?" "Frostfang trackers follow strict protocol. Every wolf pup learns the stories. They're precise, disciplined. They don't waste effort on unnecessary violence." Callum swallowed hard, clearly still shaken by what he had witnessed. These wolves weren't disciplined. They were vicious. It felt less like a tracking mission, and more like they wanted to make sure nothing survived to tell the story. Damien exchanged a look with Kieran, both of them arriving at the same unsettling conclusion at roughly the same moment. "If these were rogue elements within Frostfang," Kieran said carefully, "operating outside official pack sanction, that would explain the lack of discipline. It would also mean whoever sent them isn't planning to stop at one failed attack." "They weren't hunting a fugitive," Damien said quietly. "They were trying to eliminate a witness." Back in his private chambers, Alara listened as Damien relayed everything Callum had described, her expression growing more troubled with every detail. She sat curled in the chair by the fire now, strong enough to move on her own, though still wrapped in blankets against a cold that seemed to have settled permanently into her bones. 6 trackers, she repeated slowly. "That's not a standard retrieval team. Standard protocol sends 2, maybe 3 at most, for a fugitive case. Which means someone considered you enough of a threat to send double that number," Damien said. "Or someone wanted overwhelming force to guarantee you wouldn't survive to explain yourself to anyone." Alara pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. A small, protective gesture that made her look younger than her actual age for just a moment. "Whoever framed me for the assassination attempt must have realized I might eventually find a way to prove my innocence. Killing me quietly during the chase would look like an unfortunate accident. No formal execution, no trial, no chance for anyone to question the evidence against me. A clean solution to their problem, Damien said grimly. Except you survived. Except I survived, she echoed, though there was no triumph in her voice, only a hollow kind of disbelief. And now 3 of your guards are dead because of it. That's not on you. Damien's voice was firm, immediate, leaving no room for argument. Whoever ordered that attack made the choice to send killers across a border into another pack's territory. That responsibility belongs entirely to them. Ilara did not look entirely convinced, guilt settling heavily across her features, but she did not argue further either. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the fire, watching the flames for a long moment before speaking again. There's something else you should know, she said quietly. Something I haven't told anyone yet. Damien sat forward slightly, giving her his full attention. The night before the assassination attempt, Ilara continued, I overheard part of a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. 2 council members, talking in hushed voices near the eastern gardens. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, I think it might have been connected to everything that happened after. What did you hear? Not much. Fragments, mostly. One of them said something about timing being critical, and the other responded that the Alpha's guard rotation had been confirmed. At the time I assumed they were discussing routine security matters. Now I think they were finalizing details for the attack, and I happened to walk past at exactly the wrong moment. Did you recognize their voices? Ilara hesitated, guilt and uncertainty warring across her expression. I think one of them was Councilman Fenwick. I couldn't be entirely certain of the second voice, but something about it felt familiar, in a way I still can't quite place. Damien filed the name away carefully. Fenwick was not a name he recognized personally, but if Ilara's suspicion held any weight, it represented the first genuine lead toward uncovering who had actually orchestrated the attack on the Frostfang Alpha, and by extension, who had framed Ilara to cover their tracks. If we could prove Fenwick's involvement, Damien said slowly, working through the possibilities aloud, it would clear your name and expose the real conspiracy at the same time. But we'd need more than an overheard conversation. We'd need evidence your own pack elders couldn't dismiss. And how exactly do you propose we get that? Ilara asked, when I can't even set foot on Frostfang territory without being killed on sight. It was a fair question, and one Damien did not have an immediate answer for. The 2 packs existed in a state of uneasy, long-standing hostility, decades of accumulated grievances making any direct approach nearly impossible, without triggering exactly the kind of open conflict both sides had managed to avoid for years, despite the underlying tension. We'll find a way, he said finally, though the certainty in his voice was as much determination as it was actual confidence. But not tonight. Tonight, we need to focus on securing this territory, and making sure whoever sent those trackers doesn't get a second attempt. As if summoned by the words themselves, a sharp knock sounded at the door, and Kieran entered looking grim, a folded piece of parchment held tightly in one hand. Damien, we have another problem, he said. Word of last night's attack has already reached the council. They're demanding an emergency session, tonight, and they specifically want to know why a Frostfang wolf is currently residing in your private chambers. Damien's expression hardened, though he had known this confrontation was coming from the moment he carried Ilara through the estate doors the previous night. There was simply no way to keep something of this magnitude hidden for long, not within a household as tightly connected as Blackthorn's own leadership circle. Tell them I'll be there within the hour, he said. Damien. Ilara's voice carried a note of genuine worry as she looked between the 2 men. If your council learns everything, about the bond, about my pack, about what happened on the ridge, they might demand my immediate removal, or worse. They can demand what they like, Damien said, though something in his jaw tightened at the thought of the confrontation ahead. I've faced difficult councils before. This won't be any different. This is different, Ilara said quietly. This time, it's not just pack politics. It's an actual war brewing between our people, and I'm the spark that could set the whole thing off. Damien crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, meeting her eyes directly, his expression softening despite the tension radiating through the rest of his body. Listen to me. Whatever happens in that council chamber tonight, I am not sending you back out into danger. Not after everything you've already survived. We will figure this out together, one step at a time, starting with convincing my own people that protecting you is not a betrayal of this pack, but the right thing to do. Alara searched his face for a long moment, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation, and finding none. Slowly, cautiously, something in her chest loosened just slightly, a fragile thread of trust beginning to form, despite every instinct telling her that trust, especially toward a blackthorn wolf, was dangerous. Be careful in there, she said finally. Your council might not react well to being told their alpha has bonded with the enemy. I've never been very good at following expectations, Damien said, offering her the faintest hint of a smile, before standing and moving toward the door. Rest. I'll come find you the moment the session ends. The council chamber, when Damien arrived, was already tense with barely restrained anger. 7 senior pack members sat around a long stone table, their expressions ranging from concern to open hostility, and at the head of the group sat Councilwoman Ivy Marlowe, the sharpest political mind in the entire Blackthorn hierarchy and, on most days, one of Damien's most trusted advisors. Tonight, however, her expression carried none of the warmth their working relationship usually held. Alpha Ashford, she said, her voice carrying the formal edge reserved for the most serious of council matters. We need to discuss exactly what happened on our northern border last night, and why our patrol was slaughtered defending a Frostfang fugitive, currently residing in your private quarters. Damien took his seat at the head of the table, meeting each council member's gaze in turn before he spoke, his voice steady, despite the storm he knew was about to break loose around him. I'll tell you everything, he said. But first, you need to understand what I found on that ridge, and why leaving her there was never an option I was willing to consider. He recounted the events of the previous night with careful precision, describing the storm, the discovery of Alara half buried in the snow, the immediate and undeniable pull of the mate bond the moment her scent reached him. Around the table, expressions shifted from anger to disbelief to something closer to alarm as the full weight of the situation settled over the room. A mate bond, Councilwoman Marlowe repeated slowly, with a Frostfang wolf. Yes. Damien, do you understand what you're telling us? The ancient laws are explicit on this matter. A bond formed between rival pack lines during active territorial hostility is considered a direct threat to pack stability. The law demands rejection or exile, no exceptions, regardless of circumstance. I'm aware of the law, Damien said evenly. I've read it more times than I care to count since last night. Then you understand why this cannot continue, said Councilman Bram Whitlock, a broad-shouldered elder, who had served on the council since before Damien's father took the throne. Whatever you felt on that ridge, whatever the bond claims to demand, the survival of this pack must come first. We cannot risk open war with Frostfang over a personal attachment, however powerful it may feel to you. This isn't simply a personal attachment, Damien said, his voice sharpening slightly. 3 of our own guards were murdered last night by trackers crossing illegally onto our territory. That is an act of aggression against Blackthorn, regardless of who they were originally hunting. An act of aggression provoked entirely by her presence here, Whitlock countered. If she had never crossed our border, our guards would still be alive. If she had never crossed our border, Damien shot back, she would be dead, executed for a crime she did not commit, based on evidence that was almost certainly planted to protect the actual conspirator within her own pack's leadership. The room fell into a tense, uncertain silence at that revelation. Marlowe leaned forward slightly, her sharp eyes studying Damien with renewed interest. Explain, she said. Damien relayed what Alara had told him, the assassination attempt on the Frostfang Alpha, the poisoned dagger planted in her room, the rushed sentence handed down without a proper trial, and the overheard conversation between 2 council members discussing timing and guard rotations the night before the attack occurred. By the time he finished, even Whitlock's expression had shifted from open hostility to something more thoughtful, though no less wary. If what you're describing is accurate, Marlowe said slowly, it suggests significant internal instability within the Frostfang leadership. A conspiracy of that scale, targeting their own alpha, is not something to take lightly, regardless of our history with that pack. Which is exactly why I'm not willing to simply hand her back over to people who have already proven they're willing to condemn an innocent wolf to protect the real culprit, Damien said. Doing so would not only violate the bond, it would mean sending her directly to her death. And if the bond itself is what triggers a war between our packs? Whitlock asked, his voice tight with genuine concern, rather than simple hostility now. Have you considered that possibility, Alpha? Frostfang has hated us for 3 generations. If they learn their fugitive has bonded with our Alpha, they may see it as confirmation of exactly the betrayal they already believe her guilty of. It could be the spark that ignites open conflict between our territories. I've considered it, Damien said quietly. I don't have a perfect answer for you, Bram. What I do have is certainty that rejecting this bond, sending her away, would not prevent a war. It would simply guarantee her death and leave the actual conspirators within Frostfang free to continue whatever scheme they've already set in motion, quite possibly against us next. Marlowe exchanged a long look with several of the other council members, an unspoken conversation passing between the pack's most senior advisors before she finally spoke again. What exactly are you proposing, Alpha? For now, she remains under Blackthorn protection while we gather more information, Damien said. I want to understand the full scope of what's happening within Frostfang leadership before we make any irreversible decisions. If there is a genuine internal conspiracy threatening their Alpha, that is information both packs would benefit from uncovering, regardless of old grievances between us. And the ancient laws? Whitlock pressed. You cannot simply ignore them because it's inconvenient. I'm not ignoring them, Damien said. I'm asking this council for time to determine whether following them blindly serves this pack's actual interests, or whether it simply serves old fears that may no longer reflect the reality we're facing. The debate continued late into the night, voices rising and falling around the stone table, as council members argued both sides with increasing intensity. Some, like Whitlock, remained deeply skeptical, warning repeatedly about the dangers of provoking Frostfang further. Others, swayed by the revelation of a potential conspiracy within the rival pack's own leadership, seemed more willing to consider that the situation might be more complicated than simple enemy territory politics. In the end, no formal resolution was reached, but Marlowe, ever the pragmatist, proposed a compromise that the majority of the council reluctantly accepted. Ilara would remain under Blackthorn protection for the time being, but under strict conditions. She would not be permitted to leave the estate grounds without an armed escort. Her presence would be kept as quiet as possible to avoid inflaming tensions prematurely, and Damien would have exactly 2 weeks to gather concrete evidence of the conspiracy before the council reconvened to make a final, binding decision on how to proceed. It was not the outcome Damien had hoped for, an open, unconditional acceptance of the bond, but it was enough to buy time, and in the current situation, time felt like the most valuable resource he had. When the session finally ended, well past midnight, Damien made his way back through the quiet, darkened halls of the estate, exhaustion settling heavily into his shoulders. He found Ilara still awake, sitting by the fire exactly where he had left her hours earlier, her expression tight with anxious anticipation the moment he stepped through the door. Well, she asked. You're staying, Damien said, dropping into the chair across from her, with a tired but genuine relief evident in his voice. For now, at least. 2 weeks, under certain conditions, while we try to find real evidence of what's happening within your pack. Ilara let out a long breath, some of the tension visibly draining from her shoulders, though worry still lingered in her eyes. 2 weeks isn't very long to prove a conspiracy that's already cost me everything. No, Damien agreed. It isn't. But it's enough time to start, and starting is better than the alternative your council was originally considering. They sat together in silence for a while after that, the fire slowly burning down to embers, the exhausted weight of the day finally beginning to catch up with both of them. Outside, the estate grounds lay quiet and still beneath a clear winter sky. The storm that had brought them together, now nothing more than a distant memory, replaced by a different kind of danger entirely, one built not from ice and wind, but from secrets, betrayal, and a conspiracy neither of them yet fully understood. 3 days passed before Ilara felt strong enough to leave the bed for more than short stretches at a time, and each of those days brought her and Damien closer together in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. It started with small things. He brought her books from the estate library, histories of the Northern Territories, old maps of pack boundaries, anything that might help her understand Blackthorn well enough to feel less like a prisoner and more like a guest, however unusual her circumstances remained. She, in turn, began sharing pieces of her own life, careful at first, then gradually more open, as trust slowly took root between them. She told him about growing up as the daughter of a Frostfang council member, about learning to fight in the training yards before she could properly read, about the quiet ambitions she had once held of eventually earning a seat on the council herself, contributing to decisions that shaped her pack's future, rather than simply following the choices made by others. "That dream feels very far away now," she admitted one evening, curled into the window seat of Damien's chambers, watching snow drift lazily past the glass. "Even if my name is cleared eventually, I doubt my pack will ever trust me with that kind of responsibility again, not after everything that's happened." "You don't know that," Damien said, settling into the chair across from her with 2 cups of warm tea, a habit they had fallen into without either of them quite noticing when it began. "If we prove you were framed, if the actual conspirator is exposed, your pack may see you differently. People respect strength, and surviving what you've survived requires exactly that. You're very optimistic for someone who spent last night's council session defending an alliance most of your own people consider dangerous." "I prefer to think of it as stubborn," Damien said, and something in his tone drew a small, genuine laugh from her, the first she had allowed herself since arriving at the estate. It was moments like these, small and unremarkable on their own, that slowly began weaving something real between them. Not simply the pull of the mate bond, though that remained a constant, humming presence beneath everything else, but an actual friendship, built on shared meals and quiet conversations, and the strange, unexpected comfort of finding someone who listened without judgment in the middle of an otherwise chaotic and frightening situation. Kieran noticed the shift first, watching his alpha's demeanor change over those 3 days, in ways he had not seen since before Damien's father passed away, and the full weight of leadership settled permanently onto his shoulders. "You seem different," Kieran observed one afternoon, finding Damien in the estate's private study, reviewing Border Patrol reports with unusual focus. "Lighter, somehow, despite everything happening around us. Is that a problem?" "No," Kieran said, though something thoughtful lingered in his expression. "I just haven't seen you like this in a long time, Damien, not since before your father died." Damien did not respond immediately, his attention seemingly fixed on the reports in front of him, though Kieran suspected his mind was elsewhere entirely. "She makes things feel less heavy," he admitted finally. "I don't fully understand it myself, honestly. We've known each other for barely a few days, and yet somehow, it feels like she's always been part of this place." "That's the bond talking," Kieran said, not unkindly. "Maybe," Damien agreed. "Or maybe the bond simply revealed something that was always going to be true, given enough time. Either way, I'm not interested in fighting it, Kieran. Not anymore." Kieran studied his alpha for a long moment, before nodding slowly, some of the earlier tension in his expression easing, though not entirely disappearing. "Then let's make sure we find enough evidence to actually give this bond a fighting chance, rather than watching the Council or Frostfang tear it apart before it has the chance to become anything real." That conversation set the direction for the following days, as both Damien and Kieran began quietly working to investigate the conspiracy Alara had described, careful not to draw unwanted attention from either the Blackthorn Council, or, more dangerously, from whoever within Frostfang had orchestrated the original assassination attempt. Alara insisted on being included in the investigation, despite Damien's initial hesitation, arguing correctly that her knowledge of Frostfang's internal politics was far more detailed than anything Damien's own network of contacts could provide. "I grew up around these people," she said, seated at the study table across from Damien and Kieran, a map of Frostfang territory spread out between them. "I know which council members held genuine influence, who had rivalries worth exploiting, who might have motive to see the Alpha removed. Let me help." "It's dangerous," Damien said. "If anyone connects you to this investigation, if word somehow reaches Frostfang that you're actively working against them." "I'm already considered a traitor and a fugitive," Alara said flatly. "There's very little additional danger in actually earning that reputation by doing something worthwhile with it." Damien did not have a strong counter-argument for that, and eventually, reluctantly, he agreed to let her contribute, provided she remained within the estate grounds and avoided any direct contact with outside parties who might recognize her. Over the following days, The three of them worked through what limited information they had. Alara identified Councilman Fenwick as someone worth investigating more closely, recalling that he had recently argued publicly against several of the Alpha's proposed trade agreements, positions that would have significantly benefited from a change in leadership. She also mentioned a growing faction within the council that had quietly criticized the current Alpha's handling of border disputes, suggesting he had grown too cautious, too unwilling to assert Frostfang dominance over contested territories. If someone within that faction wanted the Alpha removed to install more aggressive leadership, Kieran said, studying the notes they had compiled, framing you would have served two purposes at once. Eliminate a potential witness to their planning, and simultaneously discredit your father's standing on the council, since your family's reputation would suffer significantly from having a daughter branded a traitor and an attempted assassin. Ilara's expression darkened at that realization, something she had not fully considered until Kieran laid it out so plainly. My father has always supported diplomatic solutions over aggression. If someone wanted to weaken his influence on the council to push through more hostile policies toward neighboring pacts, discrediting me would be an effective way to accomplish that. It fits, Damien said grimly. Political maneuvering disguised as an assassination attempt, with you positioned as the perfect scapegoat to remove both a witness and weaken an opposing political voice on the council. But we still don't have proof, Ilara said. Suspicion and theory won't be enough to convince the Frostfang Council to reconsider my sentence. We need something concrete, a confession, physical evidence, anything that can withstand scrutiny. Then we need someone on the inside, Kieran said slowly. Someone within Frostfang who can gather that evidence without raising suspicion. The room fell quiet as the implications of that suggestion settled over all three of them. Ilara had no allies left within her own pack that she trusted enough to approach with something this dangerous, and any Blackthorn wolf attempting to infiltrate Frostfang territory risked triggering exactly the kind of open conflict the council was desperately trying to avoid. There might be someone, Ilara said finally, though reluctance colored her voice. My cousin, Nora. We grew close as children, though we drifted apart in recent years after she married into a different bloodline. She holds a minor position within the household staff of the Alpha's residence. She would have access to areas most council members wouldn't think to search. Can you trust her? Damien asked. I honestly don't know anymore, Ilara admitted. Trust doesn't come easily after everything that's happened. But she never believed the accusations against me. Or at least, she never said so publicly, which given the political climate, might be the closest thing to loyalty I can hope for right now. It's a risk, Kieran said carefully. Everything about this situation is a risk, Ilara replied. The question is whether it's a risk worth taking to actually clear my name and expose whoever is responsible for all of this. Damien considered the proposal for a long moment, weighing the danger against the very real possibility that without concrete evidence, the 2 weeks the council had granted them would expire with nothing to show for it, leaving Ilara's fate entirely at the mercy of laws written to protect old grievances rather than actual justice. We reach out to her, he said finally, carefully, through channels that can't be traced back to either of us directly. If she's willing to help, we ask her to gather whatever information she can about Fenwick's movements the night before the attack, and about this faction pushing for more aggressive leadership. And if she's not willing to help? Kieran asked. Then we find another way, Damien said. But we don't stop looking. Not until Ilara's name is cleared, and not until whoever orchestrated this conspiracy answers for what they've done. Ilara looked between the two men, something fragile and hopeful flickering in her expression, for the first time since arriving at the estate. It was not certainty, not yet, but it was the first genuine sense of forward motion she had felt since the night everything in her life had fallen apart, and for now, that would have to be enough. Outside, evening settled over the Blackthorn estate, the sky deepening into shades of violet and gray as the first stars began to appear above the ridgeline. Somewhere beyond that horizon, in Frostfang territory, a conspiracy continued to unfold in the shadows, and a young woman named Nora, unaware of the danger about to reach her doorstep, went about her evening duties, with no idea that her cousin's fate, and perhaps the fate of 2 entire packs, was about to rest on her willingness to trust a memory of childhood loyalty over the fear of what discovery might cost her. Kieran left the study shortly after to arrange a discreet messenger, someone trusted enough to carry a coded letter across the border without drawing attention, leaving Damien and Alara alone, amid the scattered maps and notes covering the table between them. "Thank you," Alara said quietly, once the door had clicked shut behind Kieran. "For believing this is worth pursuing. Most people in your position would have simply handed me back over to Frostfang and let the whole matter resolve itself without any risk to their own pack." "Most people haven't felt what I felt on that ridge," Damien said simply. "Besides, I don't particularly like watching innocent people suffer for crimes they didn't commit. Call it a personal weakness. I'd call it a rare quality in an alpha," Alara said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Most leaders I've known prioritize stability over fairness every time the two come into conflict." "Stability without fairness isn't really stability," Damien said. "It's just quiet resentment, waiting for the right moment to become something worse." Alara studied him for a long moment, something contemplative in her gray eyes. "You sound like you've thought about this before. Pack leadership, I mean. Not just tonight, but for a long time." "My father wasn't always a fair man," Damien admitted, his voice quieter now, carrying a weight she hadn't heard from him before. "He believed strength alone was enough to hold a pack together. Fear kept people in line, in his mind, and questions were a luxury he didn't tolerate from those beneath him. When I took the crown, I promised myself I'd lead differently. Whether that makes me a better alpha or simply a more naive one, I honestly don't know yet." "For what it's worth," Alara said, "I think it makes you a better one. Fear might hold a pack together for a while, but it never lasts. Eventually, people stop being afraid and start being angry instead, and anger has a way of finding cracks that fear never could." Damien looked at her then, really looked, something warm and unguarded passing across his features that had nothing to do with the mate bond and everything to do with simply enjoying her company, her mind, the way she saw the world with a clarity that matched his own, more closely than he had expected from someone raised by an entirely different pack, with an entirely different set of values. "You'd make a good alpha yourself," he said, "whether your own pack ever recognizes that or not." Alara laughed softly, though there was a bittersweet edge to the sound. "That dream feels increasingly impossible with every passing day, but thank you for saying it anyway." They sat together for a while longer, the conversation drifting into easier, lighter territory. Stories from childhood, favorite places within their respective territories, small preferences and quirks that had nothing to do with conspiracies or ancient laws, or the danger still circling both of their futures. It was, Alara realized somewhere in the middle of it, the first time in longer than she could remember that she had simply enjoyed a conversation without an undercurrent of fear shaping every word. Later that night, after Damien had reluctantly excused himself to review additional border reports before retiring, Alara remained in the study a while longer, staring down at the map of Frostfang territory spread across the table. Her finger traced the familiar boundaries of her childhood home, the training grounds where she had grown up, the council chambers, where her fate had been decided, without her ever being given a chance to speak. She thought of her father, wondering if he had fought for her at all, or simply watched in silence, as the council condemned his daughter to protect whatever fragile political position he still held. She thought of Nora, and the risk she was about to ask her cousin to take on her behalf, a risk that could cost Nora everything if discovered. And she thought of Damien, of the strange, impossible warmth that had grown between them over these past few days, a warmth that felt far too fragile to survive the storm still gathering on the horizon, but one she found herself unwilling to let go of, regardless of the danger it represented. Whatever came next, whatever the investigation uncovered or failed to uncover, whatever the Blackthorn Council or her own pack ultimately decided, she understood with quiet, growing certainty that she no longer wanted to face any of it alone. And for someone who had spent the last 3 days running, hiding, and fighting simply to survive, that realization felt like the most dangerous thing of all. The reply from Nora arrived 4 days later, carried by a trusted messenger who had crossed the border under cover of a routine trade delegation, the letter hidden within the lining of a merchant's coat to avoid detection by border guards on either side. Alara's hands shook as she unfolded the small piece of parchment, Damien standing close beside her in the study, Kieran hovering near the door, all three of them holding their breath as she read the carefully coded message. "She's willing to help," Alara said, relief flooding her voice as she scanned the familiar handwriting. She says she never believed I was capable of what they accused me of. She's agreed to watch Fenwick's movements and report anything unusual. That's good news, Damien said, though caution remained evident in his tone. But we need to be careful about how much we ask of her. If she's discovered gathering information against a sitting council member, the consequences for her could be severe. I know. Alara set the letter down carefully, her expression a complicated mixture of hope and guilt. I hate putting her in this position, but I don't see another way forward. Over the following week, small pieces of information began trickling back through their careful network of coded letters and trusted messengers. Nora reported that Fenwick had been meeting privately, late at night, with a handful of other council members known for their more aggressive stance on border policy. She also discovered, through careful and cautious observation, that Fenwick had recently acquired a significant sum of unexplained wealth, funds that did not align with his official council salary or any known family inheritance. Bribery, Kieran said, studying the latest letter spread across the study table. Someone paid him to orchestrate this, or at minimum, paid him to look the other way while someone else did. But who? Alara asked, frustration evident in her voice. We still don't know who's actually behind all of this. Fenwick might be involved, but I doubt he's the mastermind. He's ambitious, certainly, but not clever enough to plan something this elaborate. Then we need to find out who's funding him, Damien said. Follow the money, and we'll likely find whoever is actually pulling the strings. It was slow, painstaking work, made more difficult by the constant need for secrecy, and the very real danger that any misstep could expose their entire investigation, endangering not just Alara, but Nora as well, along with anyone else who had helped them along the way. Damien found himself increasingly torn between his duties as Alpha, managing the day-to-day concerns of his pack, and the mounting urgency of the investigation, with the council's 2-week deadline drawing steadily closer. Alara, for her part, threw herself into the work with a fierce, almost desperate energy, spending long hours poring over maps and notes, cross-referencing everything Nora sent with her own extensive knowledge of Frostfang's internal politics. It was, Damien realized as he watched her work late one evening, candlelight flickering across her focused expression, a version of her that felt entirely different from the frightened, exhausted woman he had carried in from the storm just over a week earlier. This was Alara at her sharpest, her most determined, and he found himself increasingly drawn to this side of her as much as the quieter, more vulnerable moments they had shared. You should rest, he said gently, noticing the exhaustion beginning to show beneath her focus. You've been at this for hours. I can't rest, she said, not looking up from the notes in front of her. Every day that passes is another day the real conspirator remains free. Another day my father has to live with a daughter branded a traitor. Another day closer to your council's deadline running out. Pushing yourself to exhaustion won't make the answers appear any faster, Damien said, moving to stand behind her chair, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. You need to trust that we'll find what we're looking for, even if it doesn't happen exactly on the timeline we'd prefer. Alara finally looked up at him, exhaustion and frustration warring with something softer in her expression. What if we don't find it in time? What if 2 weeks isn't enough, and your council decides to send me away, regardless of what we've uncovered so far? Then I'll fight that decision, Damien said simply. I told you before, Alara, I'm not letting you go, regardless of what the council decides. We'll find another solution if we have to. You can't simply defy your own council indefinitely, she said. Eventually, that kind of conflict destabilizes everything you've built here. I won't be the reason your pack falls into chaos. You're not the reason for anything, Damien said firmly. The reason is a conspiracy within your own pack that framed an innocent woman to protect a killer. If my council can't see the difference between protecting justice and protecting old grievances, then perhaps it's time some of those grievances were finally challenged. Alara studied him for a long moment, something warm and fierce blooming in her chest, despite the exhaustion and fear still weighing heavily on her shoulders. Slowly, she reached up and covered his hand with her own, where it still rested on her shoulder. A small, simple gesture that carried far more weight than either of them fully acknowledged in the moment. Thank you, she said quietly. For fighting for me, even when it would be so much easier not to. Easier isn't always right, Damien said. I learned that a long time ago. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them had fully named yet, though both understood exactly what it was. Slowly, Damien's hand shifted from her shoulder to gently cup her cheek, and Alara found herself leaning into the touch almost instinctively, the mate bond humming steadily between them, pulling them closer, with a gravity that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "Alara," he murmured, his voice low, careful, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wanted to. She did not pull away. Instead, she rose from her chair, closing the small distance between them, and for a long, suspended moment, the investigation, the danger, the ancient laws standing against them, all of it faded into the background, replaced entirely by the simple, undeniable pull between two people who had found something neither of them had expected to find, in the middle of a storm that was still far from over. Their lips met softly, hesitantly at first, and then with growing certainty, as the bond between them settled into something that finally felt whole, rather than fractured by fear and uncertainty. When they finally parted, Alara rested her forehead against his, both of them breathing slightly unsteadily, a small, disbelieving smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "This is either the best decision either of us has ever made," she whispered, "or the most dangerous." "Maybe it's both," Damien said, his own smile matching hers. "I've found that the most important things in life usually are." Their quiet moment was interrupted less than an hour later by an urgent knock at the study door. Kieran entered without waiting for a response, his expression tight with barely restrained alarm. "We have a problem," he said. "Nora's latest letter arrived, but something's wrong. It's not written in her usual code." Alara's stomach dropped as she took the letter from Kieran's outstretched hand, quickly scanning the hastily scrawled message. The handwriting was rushed, uneven, nothing like Nora's usual careful script. "She thinks she's been discovered," Alara said, her voice tight with rising panic. "She says Fenwick confronted her directly this morning, asking pointed questions about her recent movements around the council chambers. She doesn't think he has proof yet, but she's certain he's suspicious." "If Fenwick suspects she's been gathering information," Damien said grimly, "he'll move quickly to either silence her or accelerate whatever plans he still has in motion." "We need to get her out," Alara said immediately. "If she's in danger because of what I asked her to do, I can't leave her there to face the consequences alone." "Alara, extracting someone from Frostfang territory, especially someone potentially being watched by a council member, is incredibly dangerous," Kieran said carefully. "It's not a decision to make lightly." "I understand the danger," Alara said, her voice firm, despite the fear evident beneath it. "But she took this risk, because I asked her to. I won't abandon her now that it's actually costing her something." Damien looked between the two of them, weighing the risks carefully, his mind already working through possible approaches, even as the urgency of the situation pressed heavily against every careful, measured decision he had made since finding Alara in the snow just over a week earlier. "We'll go," he said finally, carefully, and with a plan, "but we're not leaving her to face this alone. Kieran, gather a small team, no more than 4 or 5 of our most trusted and discreet trackers. We move at nightfall." Damien, crossing into Frostfang territory directly, especially now, with tensions already this high. "I know the risk," Damien said, "but Alara's right. We asked Nora to help us, and now she's in danger because of it. Leaving her to face that alone isn't something either of us is willing to do." Kieran studied his alpha for a long moment, then gave a short, resigned nod, already turning to begin preparations. "I'll have the team ready within the hour." As Kieran left to organize the rescue effort, Alara turned to Damien, gratitude and fear mingling in her expression. "You didn't have to agree to this. It's an enormous risk for someone who isn't even part of your pack." "She's part of your family," Damien said simply. "And you're part of mine now, whether the ancient laws recognize it or not. That makes her problem my problem too." Alara felt something in her chest tighten at those words, a warmth she had not expected to feel this deeply, this quickly, in the middle of an already chaotic and uncertain situation. Whatever fears remained about the future, about the council's deadline, about the danger still gathering around them from every direction, she found herself steadied by the simple certainty in Damien's voice, the unwavering commitment he had shown her from the very first moment he found her dying in the snow. As night fell over the Blackthorn estate, Alara insisted on joining the rescue team despite Damien's initial objections, arguing that her knowledge of the Frostfang estate grounds, the servant passages, the guard rotations, made her presence not just helpful, but essential to the mission's success. "If something goes wrong," she said, pulling on the dark, practical clothing Odalis had quietly provided for the crossing, "you'll need someone who actually knows the layout of the household. Nora's quarters are accessible through a servant's entrance on the eastern side, one most guards don't bother watching closely, because it's rarely used after dark." "And if you're recognized?" Damien asked, tension evident in every line of his body, as he checked the fastenings on his own gear. "Then we deal with that when it happens," Alara said. "I'm not letting Nora face this, because I asked for her help and then hid safely behind your borders, while she took all the risk." Damien did not argue further, recognizing the same fierce determination in her that had carried her through the storm in the first place. Instead, he simply nodded, and together they joined Kieran and the 4 trackers selected for the mission, moving out into the darkness as the last light faded from the winter sky. The crossing itself took nearly 2 hours, moving carefully through unfamiliar terrain, avoiding the main patrol routes both packs typically monitored along the contested border regions. Alara guided them through a narrow valley she remembered from childhood hunting trips, a path few outside her immediate family had ever used, emerging finally within sight of the Frostfang estate grounds just before midnight. The estate looked different than Alara remembered, tension visible even from a distance in the increased number of guards patrolling the perimeter, torches burning at intervals along walls that had once felt like home and now felt like the walls of a prison she had barely escaped. "There," she whispered, pointing toward a small, unassuming door set into the eastern wall, mostly hidden behind an overgrown hedge. "That leads to the servants' quarters. Nora's room should be the 3rd door on the left, if nothing's changed since I left." They moved carefully, Kieran and 2 of the trackers taking positions to watch for approaching guards, while Damien and Alara approached the servants' entrance, the remaining trackers covering their retreat path. The door was unlocked, exactly as Alara had hoped, and they slipped inside without incident, moving quickly and quietly through darkened hallways that Alara navigated with the ease of long familiarity, despite the danger pressing in around them. They found Nora's room exactly where Alara remembered, and Alara knocked softly, a specific pattern the 2 cousins had used as children playing hide-and-seek through the estate grounds, hoping desperately that Nora would remember it too. The door opened a crack, revealing Nora's pale, frightened face, which shifted rapidly from fear to disbelief the moment she recognized her cousin standing in the darkened hallway. "Alara," she whispered, pulling the door open further, glancing anxiously past them into the empty corridor. "You shouldn't be here. It's too dangerous." "I couldn't leave you to face this alone," Alara said, pulling her cousin into a quick, fierce embrace. "Not after everything you've already risked for me." "Fenwick knows something," Nora said quickly, her voice trembling with barely restrained panic as she pulled back. "He's been watching me for 2 days now. I think he suspects I've been passing information, though I don't believe he has proof yet, but it's only a matter of time." "Then you're coming with us," Damien said firmly, stepping forward. "Tonight. We can't leave you here to face whatever consequences he decides are appropriate once he confirms his suspicions." Nora hesitated, glancing around the small room that had been her home for the past several years, clearly torn between the fear of staying and the enormous uncertainty of fleeing everything she knew. "If I leave, I can never come back. You understand that, don't you? This isn't a temporary visit. This is exile, just like what happened to you." "I know," Alara said gently. "And I'm sorry it's come to this. But I'd rather have you safe in exile than lost to whatever Fenwick decides to do if he confirms his suspicions." After a long, tense moment, Nora nodded, quickly gathering a small bag of essential belongings, while Alara kept watch at the door. They had barely finished when the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor outside, heavy and deliberate, accompanied by low voices that made Alara's blood run cold. "That's Fenwick," she whispered urgently. "We need to move, now." They slipped back out into the hallway, just as the footsteps grew dangerously close, moving quickly toward the servants' entrance they had used to enter, hearts pounding with every step. They were nearly at the door when a sharp voice called out behind them. "Stop right there." Alara turned to find Fenwick himself standing at the end of the corridor, flanked by 2 armed guards, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion to furious recognition, as he took in the scene before him. "Alara Voss," he said, his voice cold with barely restrained anger. "Alive, and apparently in the company of blackthorn wolves. This is far more damning than I could have possibly hoped for." "You framed me," Alara said, fury overtaking fear as she faced the man responsible for destroying her entire life. "You planted that dagger. You orchestrated the entire assassination attempt." Fenwick's expression flickered, something dangerous and calculating replacing the initial surprise. "Careful with accusations you cannot prove, girl, especially while standing in enemy territory, consorting with blackthorn wolves. This will only confirm every suspicion the council already holds against you." "Then let us leave, and we'll settle this another way," Damien said, stepping forward, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of an alpha, despite standing on hostile ground. "There's no need for this confrontation to end in violence tonight. You're standing on Frostfang territory, Blackthorn Alpha," Fenwick said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "I have every right to treat this as exactly what it appears to be. An armed incursion, alongside a known fugitive, and a traitor to our pack." The guards flanking Fenwick shifted into more aggressive stances, and outside, Alara could hear the distant sound of an alarm beginning to sound, alerting the rest of the estate to the intrusion. Whatever chance they'd had of a quiet, undetected extraction had just disappeared entirely. "We need to move," Kieran said urgently, appearing at the mouth of the corridor with the rest of the tracking team, his expression tight with alarm, at the sound of the spreading alarm. "Now, before more guards arrive." Damien made a swift decision, positioning himself between Fenwick's guards and the rest of their group. "Get Alara and Nora out. I'll hold them here." "Damien, no," Alara started, but he cut her off with a sharp, decisive look. "Trust me," he said. "Go." There was no time to argue further. Kieran pulled Alara and Nora toward the exit, while Damien and two of the trackers held position, buying precious seconds as more guards began pouring into the corridor from every direction, drawn by the spreading alarm. Alara fought against Kieran's grip, desperate to stay and fight alongside Damien, but the beta's hold remained firm, his own expression grim but resolute. "He gave an order," Kieran said, practically dragging her toward the servants' entrance. "We follow it, and we trust he knows what he's doing." They burst out into the cold night air, the sound of shouting and chaos erupting behind them, as Damien's small group fought to hold the corridor long enough for the rest of them to escape. Alara's heart hammered with fear as they raced back toward the border, Nora keeping pace, despite her own exhaustion and terror, every second stretching into an agony of uncertainty about whether Damien would manage to escape the confrontation he had deliberately created to give them a chance at freedom. Damien fought with a controlled, ferocious precision, every movement calculated to disable rather than kill, aware that spilling too much Frostfang blood on their own territory would guarantee exactly the kind of open war he had been trying to avoid since the moment he first found Alara in the snow. The two guards flanking Fenwick moved to engage, and Damien shifted his focus entirely to buying time, ducking beneath a wild swing and driving his shoulder into the first guard's chest, hard enough to send him crashing into the corridor wall. The second guard hesitated for just a moment, clearly unprepared for the sheer speed and strength of an Alpha King fighting at full capacity, and that hesitation cost him the advantage entirely. Behind him, the two trackers he had brought held their own against a growing number of Frostfang guards pouring into the narrow corridor, the confined space actually working in their favor by limiting how many enemies could engage at once. Still, Damien understood with grim clarity that this advantage would not last long. More guards were coming, drawn by the spreading alarm, and eventually sheer numbers would overwhelm whatever tactical advantage the corridor currently provided. "Fenwick," Damien said, circling the council member who had remained carefully back from the actual fighting, watching with cold calculation rather than engaging directly. "This ends badly for everyone if it continues. Call off your guards, and I'll leave your territory without further incident." "You invaded Frostfang land," Fenwick said, his voice carrying performative outrage that did not quite mask the satisfaction underneath. "Alongside a known fugitive. There is no version of tonight that ends without severe consequences for Blackthorn, Alpha Ashford. The only fugitive here is the one who framed an innocent woman to cover his own crimes," Damien said, watching Fenwick's expression carefully for any flicker of reaction. "He found it," brief but unmistakable, a tightening around the eyes that confirmed everything Alara had suspected. "You're the one who should be worried about consequences tonight, Councilman." Fenwick's composure cracked slightly, anger flashing across his features before he forced it back down. "Careful with your accusations. You have no proof, and even if you did, you're hardly in a position to make demands, surrounded as you are by my guards on my own territory." Before Damien could respond, a new voice cut through the chaos of the corridor, sharp with authority that immediately silenced the ongoing struggle. "Enough." Every guard in the corridor froze, turning toward the source of the command. Damien looked up to find an older man standing at the far end of the hallway, flanked by additional guards wearing markings that indicated significantly higher rank than those currently fighting. Even without introduction, Damien recognized the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority, and a quick glance at Fenwick's suddenly pale expression confirmed his suspicion. "The Frostfang Alpha." "Alpha Ashford," the older man said, moving closer, his sharp eyes taking in the scene with obvious displeasure. "I find myself curious why the Blackthorn Alpha is currently fighting his way through my household staff quarters in the middle of the night." "Alpha Whitmore," Damien said, straightening from his defensive stance, though he remained alert, watching for any sign of continued hostility. "I apologize for the manner of this visit. It was not how I intended for us to meet." "And yet here we are," Whitmore said, his gaze shifting briefly to Fenwick, something calculating passing behind his eyes. "Councilman Fenwick, perhaps you would care to explain why an armed confrontation is currently taking place in my household, and why it apparently involves the fugitive Alara Voss." Fenwick's composure faltered further under his Alpha's direct scrutiny. She was discovered attempting to extract another household member. "I acted to prevent further breach of security by engaging in open combat with a rival Alpha on my territory, risking exactly the kind of diplomatic incident I have spent considerable effort avoiding since her escape," Whitmore said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "This seems like remarkably poor judgment for a man I've trusted with sensitive council matters, Fenwick." Damien watched the exchange carefully, sensing an opportunity forming that he had not anticipated finding tonight. "Alpha Whitmore, if I may. There are things about the assassination attempt on your life that Alara Voss believes were never properly investigated, evidence suggesting she was framed to protect the actual conspirator." Whitmore's expression sharpened with genuine interest, though skepticism remained evident in his tone. "That is a significant accusation, Alpha Ashford, one I assume you cannot make without some basis. I have reason to believe Councilman Fenwick himself may hold information relevant to who actually orchestrated the attempt on your life," Damien said carefully, watching Fenwick's expression shift rapidly from alarm to barely controlled panic. "Including recent, unexplained wealth that does not align with his official position." The corridor fell into tense silence as Whitmore turned his full attention toward Fenwick, whose composure had entirely crumbled under the weight of his Alpha's suspicious gaze. "Is this true, Councilman? Have you acquired wealth you cannot properly account for?" "Alpha, this is absurd," Fenwick said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "The word of a Blackthorn Alpha, working alongside a known fugitive, should hold no weight against my years of loyal service." "Years of service do not automatically preclude betrayal," Whitmore said coldly. "I want a full accounting of your finances by morning, Fenwick, along with an explanation for your presence here tonight, rather than in your own quarters at this hour." Fenwick's eyes darted toward the exit, calculation replacing panic in his expression, and Damien recognized the look of a man weighing the risks of flight against the consequences of remaining and facing scrutiny. Before anyone could react further, Fenwick suddenly bolted, shoving past the guard nearest him and sprinting toward a side passage. "Stop him," Whitmore commanded, and immediately several guards moved to pursue. The chase was brief but chaotic, Fenwick clearly familiar enough with the estate's layout to nearly escape through a series of connecting corridors before finally being cornered by 3 guards near the western exit. He fought briefly, desperately, before being subdued and dragged back before his Alpha, his earlier composure entirely replaced by wild, cornered panic. "Only a guilty man runs," Whitmore said quietly, studying Fenwick with an expression that had hardened into something far colder than the measured authority he had shown moments earlier. "Take him to the holding cells. I want a full interrogation." Conducted immediately. As guards led Fenwick away, still protesting his innocence with increasingly desperate volume, Whitmore turned his attention back to Damien, something thoughtful now replacing the earlier suspicion in his expression. "It appears I owe you a debt of gratitude, Alpha Ashford, however unconventional the circumstances of tonight's revelation. Where is Alara Voss now?" "Safely away from your territory," Damien said carefully. "I sent her ahead with my beta before this confrontation began." Whitmore's expression flickered with something complicated, regret perhaps, or simple exhaustion at the weight of what tonight's revelations meant for his own leadership. "I sentenced an innocent woman to death, based on evidence I now suspect was deliberately manufactured. That is not a mistake I can simply set aside, regardless of how tonight's events unfold from here." "Then perhaps we should discuss how to properly correct that mistake," Damien said, formally, and in a way that ensures her safety going forward, regardless of what Fenwick's interrogation reveals. Whitmore studied him for a long moment, something calculating but not unkind in his gaze. "You have significant personal investment in her well-being, Alpha Ashford, more than simple diplomatic concern would explain." Damien hesitated only briefly, before deciding that honesty, however dangerous, was likely the wiser path forward, given everything already unfolding tonight. "She's my mate, Alpha Whitmore. I found her nearly dead in the snow on my territory 11 days ago, and the bond struck the moment I caught her scent." The revelation clearly startled Whitmore, though he recovered his composure quickly, his expression shifting through several calculations Damien could not fully read. "A bond between our bloodlines. That complicates matters considerably, given our pack's history." "It does," Damien agreed. But I'm hoping tonight's revelations might create an opportunity to reconsider some of that history, rather than simply reinforcing it." Whitmore did not respond immediately, his gaze drifting toward the corridor where Fenwick had been dragged away, clearly turning over the enormous implications of everything he had just learned. Finally he spoke again, his voice carrying the careful weight of a leader beginning to see a path forward, through what had, only an hour earlier, seemed like an impossible situation. "Return to your territory tonight, Alpha Ashford, and bring Alara Voss back safely to my council chambers, in 3 days' time. If Fenwick's interrogation confirms what you've suggested, I intend to formally clear her name and address the conspiracy that clearly threatens the stability of my own pack's leadership. As for the matter of your bond," he paused, something almost weary but not entirely unwelcoming in his expression, "that is a conversation we will need to have separately, once the immediate crisis has been properly resolved." It was not a full resolution, not yet, but it was far more than Damien had dared hope for when he first crossed into hostile territory hours earlier. He offered a respectful nod, understanding the fragile nature of the opportunity now open before them. "Thank you, Alpha Whitmore. We'll return in 3 days." As Damien made his way back toward the border, exhaustion and relief warring within him after the chaos of the night, he found himself already anticipating the difficult conversations still waiting ahead. Clearing Alara's name would only be the beginning. The true test would come in convincing two packs, bound by generations of hostility, that the bond between their alpha and a once condemned Frostfang woman represented not a betrayal of tradition, but the beginning of something neither pack had dared imagine possible before now. He found Alara waiting just inside Blackthorn territory, pacing a worn path through the snow near the border marker, Kieran and Nora standing nearby with matching expressions of exhausted relief. The moment she caught sight of him emerging from the tree line, whole and unharmed, she broke into a run, closing the distance between them in seconds. "You're alive," she said, breathless, both hands gripping the front of his coat, as though she needed the physical confirmation to fully believe it. "I heard the alarm, I thought." "I'm fine," Damien said, pulling her into his arms, feeling the tension finally begin to drain from both of their bodies, now that the immediate danger had passed. "More than fine, actually. Fenwick's been arrested." Alara pulled back slightly, searching his face for confirmation. "Arrested? By his own pack? By his own alpha, personally?" Damien relayed the events of the confrontation as they began walking back toward the estate, Kieran and Nora falling into step behind them, listening with equal parts astonishment and cautious relief. Whitmore witnessed enough tonight to order a full investigation into Fenwick's finances and his involvement in the assassination attempt. He's asked that you return to Frostfang territory in 3 days, to formally clear your name, assuming the interrogation confirms what we already suspect. Alara stopped walking entirely, staring at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. He believes me, after everything? He's willing to consider the possibility strongly enough to launch a formal investigation, Damien said carefully, not wanting to overstate the fragile progress they had made. That's not the same as full exoneration yet, but it's more than we had this morning. Beside them, Nora let out a shaky breath, some of the fear that had gripped her since fleeing her quarters finally beginning to ease. If Fenwick is exposed, if the truth actually comes out, maybe I won't have to remain in exile after all. One step at a time, Alara said gently, squeezing her cousin's hand. But yes, if this works, there's hope for all of us. They reached the estate just before dawn, the sky beginning to lighten from black to deep, bruised purple, along the eastern horizon. Odalis met them at the door, immediately fussing over Nora's exhausted state, and ushering her toward the kitchen for warm food and a proper bed, while Kieran peeled off to begin drafting a full report of the night's events for the council. Alone finally in the quiet of Damien's private study, Alara sank into the chair by the dying fire, the adrenaline of the night finally giving way to bone-deep exhaustion. Damien knelt beside her, gently taking her hands in his own. "You should rest," he said. "We have 3 days before we need to return to Frostfang territory. Use them." "I don't know how to rest," Alara admitted quietly. "Not really. Not since this all began. There's always been something to run from, or fight for, or fear." "Then let tonight be different," Damien said. "Just for a few hours. Let yourself simply exist, without the weight of everything else pressing down on you." Alara looked at him for a long moment, something soft and vulnerable passing across her exhausted features. "Stay with me? Just until I fall asleep?" "For as long as you need," Damien said, and meant it completely. He settled into the chair beside the bed, as she finally allowed herself to rest, the first, truly peaceful sleep she had managed since the night everything in her life had shattered apart. Watching her breathe steadily in the firelight, Damien found himself thinking not of the danger still surrounding them, not of Fenwick's fate or the council's looming deadline, but simply of how far they had already come together, and how much further he was willing to go to ensure she never had to run alone again. Yet even as peace settled briefly over the estate, a quieter, more troubling thought lingered at the edges of Damien's mind. Fenwick had been caught, yes, exposed and humiliated in front of his own alpha. But something about the scale of the wealth Nora had uncovered, the coordination of the assassination attempt, the sheer audacity of framing a council member's own daughter, suggested a plan far too sophisticated for one ambitious councilman acting entirely alone. Fenwick had been a piece of the conspiracy, certainly. But standing in that corridor, watching the man's composure crumble under his own alpha's questioning, Damien had recognized something else in his desperate, cornered expression. Fear, yes, but also a flicker of something closer to relief, as though being caught meant he would no longer have to carry the full weight of a secret he had never truly controlled. Whoever had actually orchestrated the plan to eliminate the Frostfang Alpha, Damien suspected, remained very much hidden, watching from the shadows as their carefully constructed scheme began to unravel, and likely already calculating how to protect themselves now that their pawn had been captured. The true danger, he realized with quiet, unwelcome certainty, was very far from over. Fenwick's interrogation began at first light, conducted personally by Alpha Whitmore, alongside 2 senior council members, trusted enough to witness proceedings of this sensitivity. Word of the results reached Damien and Alara through a carefully coded message delivered by the same discreet messenger who had carried Nora's original letters, arriving at the Blackthorn estate just before midday. "He's talking," Alara said, reading quickly through the coded parchment, her expression tightening with each line. "He's confessed to planting the dagger, to framing me for the assassination attempt. But Damien, he's claiming he wasn't working alone. He says someone else approached him with the plan, someone who provided the funds and the poison, someone who promised him a significant promotion within the council once the Alpha was removed and a more agreeable successor installed. He's protecting them, or he's afraid of them, or both." Whitmore's continuing to press, but so far Fenwick refuses to give a name. Alara set the letter down, frustration evident in her expression. "We're so close, and yet the actual architect of this entire conspiracy is still hiding behind Fenwick's silence. Damien studied the letter carefully, turning over the implications in his mind. If Fenwick is truly afraid of this person, afraid enough to protect them even after being caught and facing serious consequences himself, that suggests someone with considerable power and influence. Someone capable of following through on threats, even from within a holding cell. Someone still active within the council, Alara said slowly, a troubling thought forming. Someone who could reach Fenwick even now, to ensure his silence. The implications settled heavily over the room. If the true conspirator remained embedded within Frostfang's leadership, capable of intimidating Fenwick into silence even after his arrest, then clearing Alara's name alone would not be enough. The actual threat, the person willing to orchestrate an assassination attempt against their own alpha, would remain free to try again, more carefully next time, with a scapegoat less likely to survive, and expose the plan. We need to return to Frostfang territory sooner than 3 days, Damien said. If Whitmore's safety is genuinely at risk from someone still operating within his own council, waiting could give this person time to either silence Fenwick permanently or attempt something desperate. Alara nodded in agreement, already gathering her things. I'll send word ahead that we're arriving tomorrow instead. They departed the following morning, this time as an official diplomatic party rather than a covert extraction team. Kieran and a small honor guard accompanying them across the border in full view of both packs' patrol routes, a deliberate statement that whatever tensions existed between Blackthorn and Frostfang, this visit was being conducted with transparency rather than subterfuge. Alpha Whitmore received them in his formal council chambers, his expression carrying the particular exhaustion of a leader who had spent the past 2 days confronting the possibility that his own trusted advisors had conspired against him. He rose as they entered, offering Alara a slight, respectful bow that she had not expected, and clearly did not know quite how to receive. Alara Voss, he said, I owe you an apology far greater than words can adequately convey. I sentenced you to death, based on evidence I now understand was deliberately manufactured, without the fair hearing you deserved. That failure rests entirely with me, regardless of who orchestrated the original deception. Thank you, Alpha Whitmore, Alara said carefully, still visibly uncertain how to navigate this unfamiliar territory of being believed rather than condemned, though I understand the full truth is still incomplete. Fenwick hasn't named who approached him. No, Whitmore said, his expression darkening, and I fear I understand why. Yesterday evening, a guard assigned to monitor Fenwick's holding cell was found unconscious, and a small vial of poison was discovered hidden near the cell bars. Fortunately, Fenwick noticed the tampering before consuming anything, but the message was clear enough. Whoever is behind this conspiracy is still active, still capable of reaching into my own household, and still very much determined to ensure their identity remains protected. Then Fenwick's testimony alone won't be enough, Damien said. We need more concrete evidence, something that identifies the actual conspirator directly, rather than relying on a frightened man's cooperation. I agree, Whitmore said, which is why I've asked my most trusted investigator to review every financial record connected to Fenwick's unexplained wealth. If we can trace the source of those funds, we may be able to identify the true architect of this scheme, without relying on Fenwick's continued cooperation. Over the following hours, Whitmore's investigator, a sharp-eyed older wolf named Gareth, who had served the pack's internal security for decades, walked them through the financial trail his team had uncovered. The funds paid to Fenwick had passed through several intermediary accounts, clearly designed to obscure their original source, but Gareth's painstaking work had eventually traced the chain back to a private holding, registered under a name that made the entire room fall silent upon its revelation. Councilwoman Sable Rourke, Gareth said grimly, laying out the final piece of documentation on the table before them. Head of the pack's Treasury Committee, and one of your most senior advisors, Alpha Whitmore. Whitmore's expression hardened into something cold and controlled, though the anger beneath it was unmistakable. Sable has served this council for over 15 years. She was one of my father's closest advisors before I took the crown. The funds are unmistakable, Gareth said, traced through 4 separate accounts, but ultimately originating from her personal holdings. She financed Fenwick's involvement, and given her position on the Treasury Committee, she would have had ample opportunity to acquire the poison used in the assassination attempt without drawing suspicion. Why? Alara asked, struggling to understand the motivation behind such an elaborate and dangerous conspiracy. What would she gain from your death, Alpha Whitmore? Beyond simple political upheaval. Whitmore's jaw tightened, something troubled and personal flickering across his features. Sable has long advocated for a more aggressive expansion policy, particularly regarding contested territories along our eastern border. I've consistently opposed those proposals, favoring diplomatic solutions over military confrontation. If I were removed, and someone more sympathetic to her positions installed as successor, she stands to gain considerable influence over PAC policy for years to come. And my father, Alara said slowly, pieces clicking together in her mind, has always been one of the strongest voices supporting your diplomatic approach. If I were discredited as a traitor, his credibility on the council would suffer significantly, weakening the opposition to her expansion policies even further. It fits, Damien said grimly. A conspiracy designed not simply to remove one Alpha, but to reshape the entire direction of Frostfang's leadership for a generation. Whitmore rose from his seat, pacing a tight line across the chamber, clearly wrestling with the enormity of the betrayal now laid bare before him. Sable must be confronted immediately, before she has any opportunity to flee or destroy further evidence. Alpha Whitmore, Gareth said carefully, if I may caution restraint. Sable Rourke retains considerable support among certain factions of the council, those who favor her expansion policies. A direct confrontation without airtight, undeniable proof risks fracturing the council entirely, especially if some of her supporters choose to defend her, rather than accept the evidence against her. Then what do you propose? Whitmore asked, frustration evident in his voice. A formal council session, Gareth said. Present the evidence openly. Allow Fenwick to testify directly if he's willing, given the attempt on his life clearly demonstrates his own danger from continued silence. Let the council witness the truth together, rather than simply announcing an accusation that some may choose to dismiss as political maneuvering. Whitmore considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. Very well. We convene the full council tomorrow morning. I want every piece of evidence prepared and ready for presentation, and I want additional guards assigned to Fenwick's cell, immediately, along with anyone else who might be considered a witness to this conspiracy. As preparations began for the following day's confrontation, Alara found herself pulled aside by her father, Councilman Aldrich Voss, who had arrived at the estate upon hearing of his daughter's return, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of relief, guilt, and lingering uncertainty about how to properly bridge the distance that recent events had carved between them. Alara, he said, his voice rough with emotion he clearly struggled to fully express. I should have fought harder for you. I should have demanded a proper trial, regardless of the pressure from the council to move quickly. I failed you when you needed me most. You didn't know the truth, Alara said, though old hurt still lingered beneath her words. None of us did, until now. That doesn't excuse my failure to at least demand due process, Aldrich said. I let fear and political pressure override what I knew, deep down, to be right. I'm deeply sorry, Alara. I don't expect that apology to undo what you've suffered, but I needed you to hear it regardless. Alara studied her father for a long moment, years of complicated history and recent betrayal warring within her, before finally allowing herself to step forward and accept his embrace, some small, fragile piece of the relationship they had once shared, beginning, tentatively, to mend. We'll rebuild from here, she said quietly, one step at a time. That evening, as the estate settled into an uneasy quiet ahead of the following day's confrontation, Damien found Alara standing alone on a balcony, overlooking the Frostfang territory grounds, watching the last light fade from the winter sky. You're worried, he observed, coming to stand beside her. Tomorrow could go very wrong, Alara admitted. If Sable has enough support on the council, if she manages to twist the evidence or discredit Fenwick's testimony, this could all fall apart. And if it does, I'm not certain what happens to either of us. Whatever happens, Damien said, taking her hand in his, we face it together. That much hasn't changed, regardless of tomorrow's outcome. Alara turned to look at him, something steadier settling into her expression, despite the uncertainty still hanging over the following day. I used to think strength meant handling everything alone, never showing weakness, never depending on anyone else to help carry the weight. And now, Now I think real strength might actually be the opposite, she said. Trusting someone enough to let them stand beside you, even when everything feels impossibly uncertain. Damien pulled her closer, resting his forehead gently against hers, the bond between them humming steady and sure, despite the storm still gathering around their futures. Whatever tomorrow brings, Ilara, you will never have to face it alone again. That's a promise I intend to keep for the rest of my life. Below them, the Frostfang estate settled into darkness, guards patrolling with heightened vigilance in anticipation of tomorrow's confrontation, while somewhere within those same walls, Councilwoman Sable Rourke was, in fact, far from unaware. Word had reached her within hours of Gareth's financial trail leading back to her private holdings, a warning delivered by a sympathetic clerk who owed her a long-standing debt of loyalty. She sat now in her private study, a glass of untouched wine before her, turning over her rapidly narrowing options with the same cold calculation she had applied to every decision across 15 years of council service. Flight was one option, but flight would be treated as confirmation of guilt, and worse, would leave her with nothing. No influence, no position, no ability to salvage even a fragment of the plan she had spent nearly 2 years carefully constructing. Denial remained possible, though Gareth's evidence sounded thorough enough that simple denial would likely fail to convince a council already primed for suspicion by Fenwick's confession and the attempt on his life within the holding cells. That attempt, she reflected grimly, had been a mistake. She had ordered it in a moment of panic, believing that silencing Fenwick before he could name her would preserve her position. Instead, it had only deepened suspicion, confirming that someone with resources and continued motive remained active and dangerous. She should have trusted Fenwick's loyalty a while longer, or better yet, should never have relied on someone so easily frightened into cooperation in the first place. There remained one final option, more dangerous than the others, but potentially more effective. If she could not avoid the confrontation entirely, she could at least attempt to control its outcome, positioning herself not as the mastermind Gareth's evidence suggested, but as an unwitting victim of her own poor judgment, manipulated by Fenwick into providing funds for what she would claim she believed was a legitimate business investment, rather than an assassination plot. It was a thin defense, and she knew it, but with enough allies willing to vouch for her character, and enough doubt cast on the reliability of evidence gathered partly through the testimony of a known Blackthorn Alpha and a previously condemned fugitive, it might be enough to survive the council session with her position, if not entirely intact, at least not immediately destroyed. She began drafting her defense late into the night, carefully rehearsing the story she would present, reaching out quietly to the handful of council members who had long supported her expansion policies and might, out of shared political interest rather than genuine belief in her innocence, be willing to raise doubts about the evidence presented against her. Morning arrived with a clear, bitterly cold sky stretching over the Frostfang estate, and the full council chamber filled steadily as senior members took their seats around the long formal table, murmurs of anticipation and unease rippling through the gathered wolves, as word of the previous day's revelations had inevitably spread through the household staff and beyond. Damien and Ilara stood near the chamber's entrance, waiting to be called forward, both of them tense with the knowledge that whatever unfolded in the coming hours would determine far more than simply Ilara's exoneration. It would determine whether the fragile trust building between Blackthorn and Frostfang, forged through this shared uncovering of conspiracy, could survive the deeper political fractures the confrontation was about to expose. "Are you ready for this?" Damien asked quietly, watching Ilara's expression as she stared toward the chamber doors. "No," she admitted, "but I don't think waiting longer would change that. Better to face it now, while the truth is still fresh enough that Sable hasn't had time to build a defense too clever to see through." Kieran, standing nearby with Nora at his side, offered a small, encouraging nod. "Whatever happens in there, you've already accomplished something remarkable. You survived. You fought for the truth despite every reason to simply run and hide, and you brought a conspiracy into the light that would have otherwise remained buried. That matters, regardless of how today's session concludes." Ilara offered him a grateful, if nervous, smile, before the chamber doors finally opened, and a formal announcement called them forward, to begin what all of them understood would be one of the most consequential confrontations any of them had ever faced. The council chamber fell silent as Ilara stepped forward alongside Damien, every eye in the room fixed on the woman who had once been condemned within these very walls, now returning not as a fugitive, but as someone with the truth finally on her side. Alpha Whitmore rose from his seat at the head of the table, his voice carrying the formal weight of official proceedings. This session is convened to address serious allegations concerning the assassination attempt on my life, and the wrongful condemnation of Alara Voss for that crime. Councilman Fenwick has confessed to planting evidence against her. Further investigation has traced the funding behind his actions to a member of this very council. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gathered elders, several heads turning toward Councilwoman Sable Rourke, who sat with carefully composed stillness near the far end of the table, her expression betraying nothing beyond polite, attentive concern. "Gareth," Whitmore said, gesturing to the investigator waiting near the chamber's side entrance, "present your findings." Gareth stepped forward, laying out the documentation methodically across the central table, walking the assembled council through the trail of accounts, the intermediary holdings, and the final connection to Sable's private financial records. He spoke clearly and without embellishment, allowing the evidence itself to carry the weight of the accusation, rather than relying on dramatic presentation. When he finished, silence hung heavy over the chamber for a long moment, before Sable finally rose, her expression carefully arranged into something between offended dignity and genuine confusion. "Alpha Whitmore, esteemed counsel," she began, her voice steady, despite the gravity of the accusation now laid before her. "I understand the severity of what's being suggested, and I want to address it directly. I was, admittedly, approached by Councilman Fenwick regarding an investment opportunity several months ago. I provided funds, believing them intended for a legitimate business venture along our eastern trade routes. I had absolutely no knowledge that these funds would be used for anything resembling what has since come to light." "A convenient claim," Damien said, stepping forward despite the formal protocol suggesting he remain silent during internal Frostfang proceedings, though Whitmore made no move to stop him, particularly given the timing and the specific amounts involved matching precisely with the funds later used to secure the poison and orchestrate the framing of an innocent woman. "I was deceived," Sable said sharply, turning her attention toward him, "just as this council was nearly deceived by evidence against Alara Voss that later proved false. Perhaps, Alpha Ashford, you might extend the same benefit of doubt to me that you so passionately demanded for her." It was a clever deflection, and Alara felt a flicker of genuine worry as she watched several council members exchange uncertain glances, clearly weighing the possibility that Sable's account, however convenient, might hold enough plausibility to create real doubt. "There's a difference," Alara said, stepping forward, before she could second-guess the decision to speak directly in front of the full council. "I had no knowledge whatsoever of the assassination attempt before it occurred. I was framed using evidence planted without my involvement. Councilwoman Rourke provided the actual funding used to carry out the attack. Claiming ignorance of the purpose doesn't change the fact that without her financial support, Fenwick would never have had the resources to execute his plan." "A reasonable point," Whitmore said, his gaze fixed steadily on Sable. "And one that raises an obvious question, Councilwoman. If you genuinely believe these funds were intended for legitimate trade investment, why has no such investment ever materialized? Why does Gareth's investigation find no evidence of any actual business venture connected to these transfers?" Sable's composure faltered slightly, the first genuine crack appearing beneath her carefully constructed defense. "I trusted Fenwick's assurances. I did not personally oversee every detail of the arrangement." "Then perhaps," Whitmore said, his voice growing colder, "you would be willing to submit to direct questioning alongside Fenwick, allowing this council to compare your accounts of events and determine whether they align or contradict one another." The suggestion clearly unsettled Sable, and Alara watched carefully as calculation flickered rapidly behind her eyes, weighing the risk of continued denial against the growing likelihood that a direct confrontation with Fenwick's testimony would expose the inconsistencies in her carefully rehearsed defense. Fenwick was brought into the chamber shortly after, escorted by 2 guards, his appearance haggard and clearly shaken by the recent attempt on his life within his own holding cell. When his eyes fell on Sable, something flickered across his exhausted features. Fear, mixed with a bitter, desperate resolve. "Councilman Fenwick," Whitmore said, his voice carrying formal authority, despite the personal betrayal clearly still weighing on him. You previously confessed to planting evidence against Alara Voss and orchestrating the assassination attempt against me. You also indicated you did not act alone. Are you now prepared to name your co-conspirator before this full council? Fenwick's gaze shifted toward Sable, and for a long, tense moment, silence stretched through the chamber, as everyone present waited to see whether fear or self-preservation would ultimately win out. Someone attempted to poison me in my own cell 2 nights ago, Fenwick said finally, his voice trembling slightly, but growing steadier as he continued. I nearly died. I have no more reason to protect the person responsible for that attempt, especially not after everything I have already lost by trusting her promises. He turned to face Sable directly. Councilwoman Rourke approached me 8 months ago. She promised significant advancement on the council if I helped remove Alpha Whitmore and install a successor more sympathetic to her territorial ambitions. She provided the poison used in the assassination attempt, and she personally suggested framing Alara Voss to eliminate a witness and simultaneously discredit her father's political influence. The chamber erupted into stunned murmurs, several council members rising from their seats in shock and outrage, as the full scope of the conspiracy was finally laid bare in explicit detail. Sable's carefully maintained composure shattered entirely, her expression twisting into something desperate and furious, as she realized her defense had collapsed completely. He's lying, she said, though the conviction had entirely drained from her voice. He's simply trying to shift blame to save himself from further punishment. The financial evidence corroborates his account precisely, Gareth said calmly. Every transfer, every date, every amount aligns exactly with what Councilman Fenwick has just described. Whitmore rose slowly from his seat, his expression carrying the particular weight of an alpha, forced to confront betrayal from someone he had trusted for over a decade. Sable Rourke, you stand accused of orchestrating an assassination attempt against your own alpha, of framing an innocent member of this pack for that crime, and of attempting to silence a co-conspirator through poison when you feared exposure. Given the severity of these crimes and the evidence now presented before this full council, I formally strip you of your council position, effective immediately, pending a full tribunal to determine appropriate punishment. Guards moved forward to escort Sable from the chamber, her protests growing increasingly desperate and incoherent as the reality of her situation finally settled in. Alara watched the woman who had nearly cost her everything being led away, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the moment brought less satisfaction than she had expected, and more simply, a profound sense of exhausted relief that the truth had finally, undeniably come to light. Once the chamber had settled following Sable's removal, Whitmore turned his attention back to Alara, his expression softening into something genuinely apologetic. Alara Voss, on behalf of this council, and this entire pack, I formally exonerate you of all charges previously levied against you. The evidence used to condemn you has been proven fabricated, and the true architects of that deception have been identified and will face appropriate justice. Around the table, several council members who had once voted for her swift condemnation now offered quiet, uncomfortable nods of acknowledgement, clearly grappling with the weight of having so readily believed evidence that had ultimately proven false. Thank you, Alpha Whitmore, Alara said, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and lingering exhaustion from the enormous weight finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. I only hope this experience encourages more careful consideration before condemning someone so quickly in the future. A fair and necessary lesson, Whitmore agreed. One I intend to take seriously in how this council conducts itself going forward. As the formal proceedings began winding toward their conclusion, Whitmore's gaze shifted toward Damien, something more personal, entering his expression now that the immediate crisis had been resolved. There remains, of course, the matter we discussed previously, the bond between yourself and Alara Voss. The chamber quieted once more, every council member's attention now fixed on this new and unexpected topic, clearly aware that whatever came next carried implications extending far beyond the conspiracy they had just successfully exposed. I understand this remains a complicated matter, Damien said carefully, given our pack's long history and the ancient laws governing bonds between rival bloodlines. It is complicated, Whitmore agreed, but I find myself, after everything this investigation has revealed, considerably less inclined to place blind faith in old laws that nearly cost an innocent woman her life through their rigid application. Perhaps it's time this council seriously considered whether those laws still serve our people's genuine interests, or whether they simply perpetuate old grievances that no longer reflect the reality standing before us. Ilara felt Damien's hand find hers beneath the table, a small, grounding gesture amid the enormous uncertainty still hanging over exactly what Whitmore's words would ultimately mean for their future together. "What are you proposing, Alpha Whitmore?" she asked. Whitmore studied them both for a long moment, something almost warm settling into his expression, despite the formal weight of the chamber around them. "I propose we convene a joint council session, Blackthorn and Frostfang together, to formally discuss not simply your individual bond, but the broader possibility of lasting peace between our two packs. Enough blood has been spilled over old grievances. Perhaps it's time we considered building something new instead." The suggestion hung in the air, enormous in its implications, and Ilara found herself hardly daring to believe that the same council chamber that had once condemned her to death might now be considering a future built on partnership rather than perpetual hostility. "I would welcome that discussion," Damien said, his voice steady despite the significance of the moment. "My own council has already granted a measure of patience regarding this bond, though I suspect they'll be considerably more receptive once they learn the full truth of what's transpired here today." "Then let us set a date," Whitmore said. 2 weeks from now, at neutral ground along the border, both councils together. It will not be a simple conversation, I suspect. There are elders on both sides who will resist any suggestion of lasting peace, clinging to grievances that have defined their entire lives. But I believe the attempt is worth making, regardless of how difficult the path ahead proves to be. The session concluded shortly after, the formal weight of the chamber slowly giving way to a quieter, more subdued atmosphere as council members began filing out, many of them pausing to offer Ilara brief, uncertain words of apology or acknowledgement before departing. It would take time, she understood, for the deeper wounds of her wrongful condemnation to fully heal, but the beginning of that healing had, undeniably, finally taken root. Outside the chamber, her father waited, his expression carrying open relief and pride that had been notably absent during the difficult weeks preceding this moment. He embraced her tightly, murmuring words of apology and gratitude that needed no further elaboration between them. "I'm proud of you," he said, "for surviving, for fighting for the truth, and for finding the strength to forgive a pack that failed you so completely." "I haven't fully forgiven yet," Ilara admitted honestly, "but I'm willing to try, especially if it means building something better for whoever comes after us." Nora joined them soon after, her own future now considerably brighter, given Sable's exposure, and the formal exoneration Ilara had just received. "Does this mean I can finally come home?" she asked, hope evident in her voice after days of uncertain exile. "I don't see why not," Whitmore said, having overheard the question as he passed by. "Your assistance in exposing this conspiracy deserves recognition rather than punishment. Consider your position here fully restored, with my personal gratitude." Relief washed visibly over Nora's exhausted features, and Ilara pulled her cousin into a fierce, grateful embrace, grateful beyond words that the sacrifice Nora had made on her behalf had not, in the end, cost her everything she held dear. That evening, as the Frostfang estate settled into a quieter rhythm following the day's dramatic revelations, Damien found Ilara standing once more on the same balcony where they had shared their worried conversation the night before, though her expression now carried something lighter, something closer to genuine hope than the anxious uncertainty that had gripped her then. "It's strange," she said, as he came to stand beside her. "Yesterday, I stood here terrified of what today might bring. Now I can hardly believe how much has actually changed in such a short amount of time." "The hardest part is often simply surviving long enough to see things through," Damien said. "You did that, Ilara, against every odds stacked against you." "We did that," she corrected gently, turning to face him fully. "I couldn't have gotten here alone. Not through the storm, not through the investigation, not through any of it." Damien reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face, something deeply tender in the gesture, despite the enormous political weight still hanging over their future together. 2 weeks from now, both our councils will sit together and decide what comes next for us, and perhaps for both our packs entirely. Whatever they decide, I want you to know that my choice was never really in question. Council decision or not, ancient law or not, you are my mate, and I intend to stand beside you for the rest of my life." Ilara felt something warm and overwhelming bloom in her chest at his words, the culmination of everything they had fought through together finally settling into something that felt, for the first time since the storm had first brought them together, genuinely and unshakably certain. "Then let's face whatever comes next together," she said softly, "starting with whatever peace we can help build between our people." Above them, the winter stars emerged slowly across the clearing sky, silent witnesses to a fragile, hard-won hope neither of them had dared to imagine possible only 2 weeks earlier, when a dying girl in the snow had first crossed paths with an Alpha King who refused to let her go. The 2 weeks leading up to the joint council session passed in a blur of preparation, negotiation, and cautious hope, though not without significant resistance from factions within both packs, who viewed any suggestion of lasting peace with deep suspicion. Within Blackthorn territory, Councilman Whitlock remained among the most vocal skeptics, arguing repeatedly during preliminary discussions that generations of hostility could not simply be dissolved through a single council session, regardless of how compelling the circumstances that had brought Damien and Ilara together. Within Frostfang, similar resistance emerged from elders who had spent their entire lives viewing Blackthorn as an existential threat, unwilling to easily set aside decades of ingrained distrust. "This won't be simple," Kieran warned Damien during one of their final preparation meetings before the scheduled session. "Even with Sable exposed and Ilara's innocence proven, there are people on both sides who will resist any move toward genuine peace, regardless of the evidence in front of them." "I know," Damien said, "but avoiding the attempt because it's difficult isn't leadership. It's simply fear, wearing a different mask." Ilara, for her part, spent much of those 2 weeks working alongside her father and Nora to help rebuild bridges within her own pack, slowly re-establishing relationships that had fractured during her exile, though the process remained slow and, at times, painfully uncomfortable. Some former friends approached her with genuine apology and relief at her exoneration. Others remained distant, uncertain how to reconcile their earlier readiness to condemn her with the truth now laid bare before them. "It will take time," her father reminded her, gently, during one particularly difficult afternoon, after a former training partner had offered only a stiff, awkward greeting, rather than the warm reunion Ilara had once hoped for. "Trust, once broken, rebuilds slowly, even when the original break wasn't truly your fault." "I understand that," Ilara said. "I just hadn't expected it to feel quite this lonely, even after being proven innocent." "You're not alone," her father said. "Not anymore. Whatever distance remains between you and old friends, you've built something remarkable with Damien, and with Nora, standing firmly by your side throughout all of this. That's no small thing." The morning of the joint council session arrived crisp and clear, a stretch of neutral ground near the border between the two territories chosen specifically for its symbolic significance, a place where generations of Blackthorn and Frostfang patrols had once clashed in territorial disputes, now serving instead as the setting for an unprecedented attempt at genuine reconciliation. Both councils arrived in formal procession, tension palpable in the careful, measured distance both delegations maintained as they took their positions around a large circular gathering space, constructed specifically for the occasion. Damien and Ilara stood together near the center, flanked by Kieran and Whitmore respectively, all of them acutely aware of the historic weight of the moment, now unfolding before dozens of watching eyes from both packs. Whitmore opened the proceedings, recounting for the full gathered assembly the events of the past several weeks, the assassination attempt, Ilara's wrongful condemnation, the conspiracy ultimately traced back to Sable Rourke's ambitions, and the courage displayed by those who had risked everything to uncover the truth. As he spoke, murmurs rippled through both delegations, some nodding in cautious understanding, others remaining visibly skeptical despite the compelling nature of the account. "What we witnessed," Whitmore continued, "was not simply a personal betrayal within my own council, but a stark reminder of how easily old grievances and rigid tradition can be weaponized against innocent people when we refuse to question inherited hostility. Ilara Voss nearly died, twice, because our two packs have spent generations treating each other as enemies, rather than neighbors capable of coexistence." Damien stepped forward to continue, addressing both delegations directly. "I found Ilara dying in the snow on my own territory, and in that moment, nothing about our pack's history mattered to me beyond the simple, undeniable truth that a person was suffering, and within my power to save. Since then, working together across the border that has long divided our people, we uncovered a conspiracy that threatened both our pack's stability. That cooperation, forged from crisis, revealed something I believe is worth building upon deliberately, rather than treating as simply an unusual exception. Whitlock rose from among the Blackthorn delegation, his expression carrying genuine, if respectful, skepticism. Alpha Ashford, I don't doubt the sincerity of your experience, or the genuine danger Alara Voss faced. But personal circumstance, however compelling, does not automatically translate into a foundation for lasting peace between two packs, with generations of accumulated grievances. Territorial disputes, resource competition, old losses on both sides. These tensions existed long before this particular conspiracy, and they will remain long after today's session concludes. A fair concern, Damien acknowledged. I'm not suggesting today's session alone resolves every tension between our peoples. I'm suggesting we begin the difficult, ongoing work of addressing those tensions directly, through dialogue rather than continued hostility, starting with this conversation and continuing through whatever mechanisms both councils agree are necessary going forward. The discussion continued for hours, difficult and often contentious, as representatives from both packs raised long-standing grievances, territorial disputes dating back generations, resource competition along contested borders, old losses that still carried raw emotional weight for families who had lost members during past conflicts. Alara found herself speaking several times, offering her own perspective as someone who had experienced firsthand both the failures and the potential for genuine change within her own pack's institutions. Slowly, painstakingly, the tone of the discussion began to shift. Not toward complete resolution. The deeper grievances between the packs were far too complex to resolve within a single session, but toward a genuine willingness to continue the conversation, rather than simply retreating back into old patterns of mutual suspicion and hostility. It was during a brief recess, as both delegations took a moment to regroup before continuing negotiations into the afternoon, that the day's fragile progress was suddenly and violently interrupted. A commotion erupted near the eastern edge of the gathering space, shouts of alarm cutting through the previously measured atmosphere, as several guards from both packs converged toward a disturbance Alara could not immediately see. Her heart lurched with sudden dread as she recognized Nora's voice among the rising panic, sharp with fear rather than her usual calm composure. She pushed through the gathering crowd alongside Damien, both of them arriving to find a scene that stopped her heart entirely. Kieran lay on the ground, blood spreading rapidly across his side, his expression pale and pained as Nora knelt beside him, pressing desperately against the wound with trembling hands. "What happened?" Damien demanded, dropping immediately to his knees beside his beta, his voice tight with alarm. "Someone attacked from the tree line," Nora said, her voice shaking. "A hidden assailant. I couldn't see clearly, but Kieran pushed me out of the way before the blade could reach me. He took the wound meant for someone else entirely. Someone had attempted to disrupt the peace negotiations through violence, and Kieran, ever loyal, had placed himself directly in harm's way to protect Nora from an attack that appeared to have been deliberately aimed at derailing today's fragile progress." "Get Odalis," Damien said urgently to one of the nearby guards, before turning his attention to applying pressure alongside Nora, his expression carrying barely controlled fury beneath the immediate concern for his beta's survival. "Kieran, stay with me. Don't you dare give up now." "Wouldn't dream of it," Kieran managed, his voice weak but carrying a thread of dark humor despite the severity of his injury, though I could have chosen a less dramatic way to prove my loyalty. Whitmore arrived moments later, his own expression grim, as guards from both packs fanned out to search the surrounding tree line for any sign of the attacker. "This was a deliberate attempt to sabotage today's negotiations," he said, kneeling beside the wounded beta, with genuine concern evident in his voice. "Whoever remains loyal to Sable's ambitions, or simply opposed to peace between our packs, clearly hoped violence would collapse this entire process before it could take root." "Then they failed," Alara said fiercely, watching as Odalis arrived, quickly assessing Kieran's wound, with practiced efficiency, before beginning the necessary work to stabilize him. "If anything, this proves exactly why we need to continue, not abandon, this process. Whoever did this wants us divided and afraid. We can't let them succeed." Odalise worked quickly, her expression tight with concentration, as she staunched the bleeding and began the delicate process of assessing the full extent of the damage. "The wound is serious," she said finally, "but not immediately fatal, provided we get him proper treatment quickly. He was fortunate the blade missed anything vital." Guards from both packs continued combing the surrounding forest for any trace of the attacker, though the search ultimately yielded little beyond a single discarded blade bearing no identifying markings, suggesting whoever had attempted the attack had planned carefully enough to avoid leaving traceable evidence. As Kieran was carefully transported to receive further medical attention, the mood among both delegations shifted from cautious hope to grim, determined resolve. Rather than scattering in fear as the attacker had presumably intended, representatives from both packs gathered once more around the central meeting space, united now not simply by the abstract concept of peace, but by shared outrage at an attempt to violently derail their efforts through cowardly means. "This attack," Whitmore said, addressing the full assembly with renewed intensity, "was clearly intended to convince us that peace between our packs is impossible, that violence and old hostility remain the only viable path forward. I refuse to accept that conclusion, and I suspect, given what I've witnessed here today, that many of you share that refusal." Whitlock, who had spent much of the earlier session voicing skepticism about the entire peace process, rose slowly. His expression notably shifted from earlier reluctance to something more resolute. "I remain uncertain about many aspects of what full reconciliation between our packs might ultimately require. But I am entirely certain that whoever attacked Beta Kieran today does not deserve the satisfaction of watching their violence succeed in dividing us further. If nothing else, today has convinced me that continuing this dialogue, difficult as it remains, is preferable to allowing fear and old hostility to dictate our future indefinitely." A murmur of cautious agreement rippled through both delegations, and Alara felt something fragile but genuine solidify among the gathered representatives, a shared understanding that whatever remained unresolved between their two packs, the attempt to derail today's progress through violence, had instead only strengthened their collective resolve to continue forward. The session continued late into the afternoon, difficult negotiations gradually giving way to the beginnings of a formal framework for ongoing dialogue between the two packs, addressing not just the immediate matter of Damien and Alara's bond, but broader questions of territorial disputes, resource sharing, and mechanisms for resolving future conflicts, without resorting to the violence that had defined their relationship for generations. By evening, as both delegations finally began dispersing back toward their respective territories, exhausted but carrying something that felt genuinely different from the hostility that had brought them to this neutral ground in the first place, Alara found herself standing beside Damien near the edge of the gathering space, watching the last light fade from the winter sky. "Kieran will recover," Damien said, relief evident beneath the exhaustion in his voice, having received word from Odalise, confirming his beta's condition had stabilized considerably since the attack. "Odalise says he'll need several weeks to fully heal, but he'll recover completely." "Thank the stars," Alara said, genuine relief washing through her at the news. "He risked everything to protect Nora today. I don't know how we'll ever properly repay that kind of loyalty. By making sure his sacrifice means something," Damien said. "By continuing this work, regardless of how many more obstacles someone tries to place in our path." Alara nodded, watching as the last members of both delegations disappeared into the gathering darkness, carrying with them the fragile beginnings of something neither pack had dared attempt in generations. 3 days later, while Kieran continued his recovery under Odalise's watchful care, Gareth arrived at the Blackthorn estate with news regarding the investigation into the attack. He had spent the intervening days tracing the discarded blade found near the tree line, cross-referencing its distinctive make with weapon suppliers known to serve both territories, and had finally identified a match. "The blade was crafted by a smith operating along the eastern border," Gareth explained, laying out his findings before Damien, Alara, and Whitmore, who had traveled to Blackthorn territory personally to review the investigation's progress. More significantly, records show it was purchased 3 weeks ago by someone using a false name, but paid for with funds traced back to an account connected to one of Sable Rourke's known associates, a minor council aide named Percy Holt. "Sable's reach extends further than we initially believed," Whitmore said grimly. "Even stripped of her position and awaiting tribunal, she apparently retained enough loyal associates to attempt one final act of sabotage against the peace process. "Has Holt been located?" Damien asked. "Guards apprehended him early this morning," Gareth confirmed. "He's confessed to carrying out the attack under Sable's instruction, delivered through a coded message smuggled out of her holding cell before additional security measures were implemented, following the earlier poisoning attempt. He claims he was meant to target you directly, Alpha Ashford, or failing that, disrupt the negotiations severely enough to collapse the entire peace process. Kieran's intervention, protecting Nora, inadvertently placed him in the path meant for someone else." The revelation settled heavily over the room. Even removed from power and awaiting judgment, Sable had continued orchestrating violence, desperate to salvage some fragment of the chaos she had originally hoped to create through the assassination attempt on Whitmore's life. "What happens to her now?" Ilara asked. "The tribunal convenes in 2 days," Whitmore said. "Given this latest attempt, along with the original conspiracy and the poisoning of Fenwick, I doubt there will be much leniency extended in the final judgment. She will face the full weight of Frostfang law for crimes that have now cost innocent people their safety twice over." "And Holt?" Damien asked. "He acted under her direction, but he still chose to carry out an attack that nearly killed your beta," Whitmore said. "He'll face his own consequences, though perhaps somewhat tempered, given his cooperation in confirming Sable's continued involvement." The following days brought a strange, uneasy mixture of relief and lingering tension as word of Holt's confession spread through both packs, confirming that the threat to the peace process, while serious, had ultimately originated from a single desperate source, rather than representing broader, organized resistance from either pack's population. Slowly, cautiously, the momentum toward continued dialogue between Blackthorn and Frostfang began to steady once more. Kieran's recovery progressed steadily under Odelis's care, and by the time the tribunal convened to determine Sable's final judgment, he had regained enough strength to sit up and receive visitors, though Odelis remained firm that full physical recovery would still require several more weeks of careful rest. "You didn't have to throw yourself in front of that blade," Nora said, sitting beside his bed during one of her frequent visits, her voice carrying equal parts gratitude and gentle scolding. "You could have simply called out a warning." "There wasn't time," Kieran said, offering her a tired but genuine smile. "Besides, I've grown rather fond of having you around these past few weeks. Seemed worth the risk to make sure that continued." Nora flushed slightly, something warm and unguarded passing across her features that suggested the sentiment was very much mutual, though neither of them pursued the thought further in that particular moment. The fragile beginning of something new, quietly taking root alongside everything else that had changed in recent weeks. Ilara, watching this small exchange from the doorway, felt a quiet, genuine warmth settle over her, a reminder that amid all the danger and political upheaval of recent weeks, something hopeful had managed to take root regardless, connections forming between people who might never have crossed paths at all, if not for the storm that had first brought her and Damien together. The tribunal, held before the full Frostfang Council, concluded with a sentence of permanent exile for Sable Rourke, stripped entirely of her titles, her wealth confiscated to compensate those harmed by her actions, and formally barred from ever returning to Frostfang territory, under threat of severe punishment should she attempt to defy the ruling. It was not the death sentence some council members had initially demanded, but Whitmore had argued, ultimately successfully, that permanent removal from any position of influence served justice more effectively than simple retribution, allowing the pack to move forward without the additional weight of further bloodshed. As the immediate crisis finally resolved itself and the dust settled around the dramatic revelations of recent weeks, Damien and Ilara found themselves, for the first time since the storm had originally brought them together, with a rare and precious stretch of quiet ahead of them, the looming threats finally addressed, the conspiracy fully unraveled, and nothing standing between them beyond the final, formal question both councils had agreed to properly address, once the immediate danger had passed. The matter of their bond, and what it might mean for the future of two packs finally, tentatively, choosing peace over generations of inherited hostility. Spring arrived earlier than usual that year, the last stubborn patches of snow finally melting away from the northern ridge where, months earlier, Damien had first found Ilara dying in the storm. The transformation of the landscape felt, to both of them, like a quiet reflection of everything that had changed since that night. The harsh, unforgiving winter, finally giving way to something warmer, something filled with genuine possibility, rather than simple survival. The formal joint council session convened once more, this time not amid the tension and uncertainty of their first meeting, but with a foundation of trust carefully built over the preceding months, through continued dialogue, small acts of cooperation along contested border regions, and the shared memory of having faced down a conspiracy together that had nearly cost several lives before the truth finally emerged. Whitlock, who had once stood among the most vocal skeptics of any lasting peace between the packs, rose first to address the gathered assembly, his expression carrying none of the earlier reluctance that had marked his participation in previous sessions. I have spent considerable time these past months reflecting on what our two packs might actually build together, rather than continuing to define ourselves entirely through old grievances, he said. I confess, I did not expect to stand before you today, prepared to formally support this union, and yet here I am, convinced that Alpha Ashford and Alara Voss represent something genuinely worth embracing, rather than fearing. Murmurs of agreement rippled through both delegations, a stark contrast to the uncertain, skeptical atmosphere that had characterized their very first meeting on this same neutral ground months earlier. Whitmore stepped forward next, his voice carrying the formal weight befitting the historic nature of the moment now unfolding before both assembled councils. Generations of hostility between Blackthorn and Frostfang have cost both our peoples dearly, in lives lost, in resources wasted on conflict that served neither pack's genuine interests, in trust broken that took far too long to begin rebuilding. Today, I formally recognize the bond between Alpha Damien Ashford and Alara Voss, not simply as an exception to the ancient laws that once would have demanded their separation, but as the foundation for a new understanding between our two territories. He turned to address the full assembly, his voice growing stronger with genuine conviction. Effective from this day forward, the ancient laws prohibiting bonds between rival pack lines are formally repealed, replaced with a new framework, recognizing that fate does not draw its boundaries according to old political grievances, and that our two packs are stronger united through genuine partnership than divided by inherited hostility. The formal repeal, debated extensively in the weeks leading up to this session, represented far more than simply clearing the path for Damien and Alara's relationship. It signaled a genuine shift in how both packs understood their relationship to one another, an acknowledgement that the old ways, however deeply ingrained, no longer served the interests of either pack's future. Alara felt tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes as she listened to the formal declaration, months of uncertainty, danger, and hard-won trust finally crystallizing into this single historic moment. Beside her, Damien's hand found hers, steady and warm, a physical anchor amid the overwhelming significance of what was unfolding around them. With the ancient laws formally addressed, Whitmore continued, I would like to extend a personal invitation, on behalf of the Frostfang Pack, to formally recognize Alara Voss's union with Alpha Ashford, through a ceremony befitting both her original heritage and her new position as Luna of the Blackthorn Pack. It would be my honor to witness this celebration, alongside representatives from both our packs, as a symbol of the peace we have worked so hard to build together. The ceremony took place 3 weeks later, on a clear, bright afternoon at the Blackthorn estate, the grounds transformed with careful attention into a space that honored both packs' traditions, Frostfang's distinctive silver and white decorations woven together with Blackthorn's deep forest greens and warm golds, a visual representation of the union now being formally celebrated. Alara stood at the edge of the gathered crowd, her father beside her, both of them taking a quiet moment before the ceremony formally began. Aldrich Voss looked at his daughter with an expression of profound pride and relief, the difficult months since her wrongful condemnation finally giving way to something resembling genuine peace. I never imagined, on the night you fled our territory, he said quietly, that we would end up here, celebrating not just your survival, but a union that might genuinely change the course of relations between our two packs for generations to come. Neither did I, Alara admitted, smiling despite the nervous flutter in her chest. I only hope to survive the night, honestly. Everything since has felt like more than I ever dared to imagine possible. You've earned every bit of it, Aldrich said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, before offering his arm to walk her toward where Damien waited near the ceremonial arch, constructed specifically for the occasion, from branches gathered equally from both territories. Nora, standing nearby beside Kieran, who had fully recovered from his injuries months earlier, caught Alara's eye and offered an encouraging smile, her own hand resting comfortably in Kieran's, as their own quiet romance had continued blossoming steadily throughout the preceding months. Another unexpected gift, born from the chaos and danger they had all weathered together. The ceremony itself unfolded with quiet, genuine beauty, Whitmore and Damien's own father figure among the Blackthorn elders, jointly presiding over the formal recognition of their bond, weaving together traditions from both packs into something new and uniquely their own. When Damien finally turned to face Alara, taking both her hands in his own before the assembled crowd of Blackthorn and Frostfang wolves gathered together in genuine celebration, rather than wary tension, something in his expression carried the full weight of everything they had survived together to reach this moment. "I found you dying in the snow," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd, though the words felt intensely personal despite the public setting. "I had no idea, in that moment, that I was finding not simply someone to save, but the person who would fundamentally change how I understood strength and loyalty, and what it truly means to lead with both conviction and compassion. Alara Voss, you have taught me more about genuine courage than anyone I have ever known, and I am endlessly grateful that fate chose to bring us together, regardless of every obstacle that once stood between us." Alara felt tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, months of fear, uncertainty, and hard-won triumph finally giving way to pure, unguarded joy. "You saved my life twice," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly evident beneath it. "Once from the storm, and once from a fate I never deserved. But more than that, you gave me something I thought I had lost entirely, the night my own pack turned against me. You gave me back my belief that justice and genuine partnership are still possible, even between people raised to see each other as enemies. I am endlessly grateful to stand here today, not simply as your mate, but as your equal partner in whatever comes next for both our peoples." The formal exchange of vows concluded to enthusiastic celebration from the gathered crowd, wolves from both Blackthorn and Frostfang territories mingling together with genuine warmth throughout the following celebration, sharing food and stories, and the particular joy of witnessing something that had once seemed entirely impossible, finally becoming reality. As evening settled over the estate grounds, string lights woven through the trees casting a warm, golden glow across the celebrating crowd, Damien and Alara found a quiet moment away from the festivities, standing once more on the same balcony where they had shared so many important conversations throughout the preceding months. "Do you remember?" Alara said, leaning against him as they watched the celebration continuing below. "What you said to me that very first morning, when I asked why you saved me instead of leaving me to freeze." "I remember," Damien said. "I told you that the moment I caught your scent, something in me refused to consider any other option." "I think about that moment often," Alara said. "How different everything could have turned out if you had simply followed the old rules, if you had left me there, or handed me back to Frostfang the moment you learned what I was. I could never have done that," Damien said, pulling her closer. "Not once I understood who you truly were, beneath the fear and the danger, and the mark on your wrist that everyone else saw as an insurmountable obstacle. You were never simply a Frostfang fugitive to me, Alara. You were, from that very first moment, exactly who you needed to be, for both of us to find our way here." Below them, the celebration continued late into the evening, Kieran and Nora dancing together near the edge of the gathering, her father deep in genuine conversation with several Frostfang elders who had once voted for his daughter's condemnation, now working alongside him to help build the foundation for lasting peace between their territories. Whitmore himself remained late into the celebration, raising a final toast to the future both packs now shared, a future built not on old grievances and inherited hostility, but on the courage to choose something different when fate presented the opportunity. Alara looked out over the celebrating crowd, over the warm lights and joyful sounds filling the estate grounds that had once felt so foreign and frightening during her first desperate days, as a fugitive seeking shelter from a storm that had nearly claimed her life. Now, standing here as Luna of the Blackthorn pack, surrounded by people from both her old home and her new one, all gathered together in genuine celebration, rather than wary hostility, she understood with quiet, profound certainty that every difficult moment of the preceding months, every danger faced, and every fear overcome, had led her exactly here. "Whatever comes next," she said softly, turning to face Damien fully. "I'm ready for it. Together." "Together," Damien agreed, and as he pulled her into a gentle kiss beneath the star-filled sky, both packs celebrating below them in genuine, unguarded joy, the ancient hostility that had once defined their peoples finally began, truly and lastingly, to give way to something far more powerful. In the weeks that followed the celebration, the newly formed alliance between Blackthorn and Frostfang began bearing tangible fruit. Trade routes long closed by decades of mutual suspicion reopened along the eastern border, bringing renewed prosperity to villages on both sides that had suffered under years of restricted commerce. Joint patrols, once unthinkable, began operating along the shared border, addressing security concerns that had once been used to justify continued hostility, but which both packs now recognized were far more effectively managed through cooperation than division. Kieran, fully recovered and formally recognized for his role in protecting both Nora and the broader peace process, found himself increasingly involved in the ongoing diplomatic efforts between the two packs, his steady judgment and quiet courage earning him respect from Frostfang representatives who had initially approached the new alliance with considerable wariness. His relationship with Nora continued to deepen as well, the two of them eventually choosing to formalize their own bond in a smaller, quieter ceremony that nonetheless carried its own quiet significance as further proof of the genuine connections now forming between the two once divided peoples. Fenwick, whose confession had ultimately unraveled the entire conspiracy despite his own guilt in the initial framing, faced a lengthy period of restricted duties and probation within Frostfang, though Whitmore, weighing the man's cooperation against the severity of his crimes, ultimately spared him the harshest possible punishment. It was not full redemption, but it offered a measured path forward, one final reminder that even those who had participated in genuine wrongdoing might still find some way to contribute meaningfully once the truth had been properly addressed. Ilara's father, Aldrich Voss, found his own standing within the Frostfang Council, considerably strengthened in the aftermath of the conspiracy's exposure. His consistent advocacy for diplomatic solutions over aggressive expansion finally vindicated by the disastrous consequences of Sable's alternative vision. He became, in the months that followed, one of the strongest voices advocating for continued cooperation between the two packs, often working directly alongside Whitlock, his former ideological opponent within the joint council sessions. The two of them finding common ground neither had expected to discover in their approach toward building lasting peace. As for Ilara herself, she settled gradually into her new role as Luna of the Blackthorn Pack, though she made clear from the outset that her position would not simply be ceremonial. She took an active hand in continuing the diplomatic work that had first brought her and Damien together, traveling regularly between both territories to help mediate disputes, strengthen trade relationships, and ensure that the fragile peace they had built together continued to deepen rather than fade with time, as so many similar attempts throughout history had eventually done, once the initial urgency faded. "You could simply enjoy being Luna," Damien teased her gently one evening, watching her pore over yet another set of border trade proposals late into the night. "No one would fault you for taking some time to simply rest, after everything you've already survived." "I spent too long being told what my future should look like by people who never actually asked what I wanted," Ilara said, though warmth rather than defensiveness colored her voice. "I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure that never happens to anyone else, if I can help it. Besides," she added, glancing up at him with a soft smile, "I rather enjoy this work. It feels like exactly what I was always meant to do, even if the path to get here looked nothing like what I once imagined." Damien crossed the room to press a gentle kiss to the top of her head, genuine admiration evident in every line of his expression. "Then I'll make sure you always have exactly what you need to keep doing it." Outside their window, the estate grounds stretched peacefully beneath a clear night sky, the same ridge where Damien had once found her dying in the snow, now visible in the distance, transformed by season and circumstance alike into simply another part of the landscape they now shared, rather than the sight of the desperate, frightening night that had first brought their two very different worlds crashing together. A partnership built not from fear, but from the simple, undeniable truth that even the deepest divides can be bridged when two people choose courage over convention, and love over the weight of old, inherited grievances. The Alpha King had found a dying girl in the snow. He had never expected her to become his forbidden mate, his fiercest ally, and ultimately, the woman who would help him build a future neither of their packs had ever dared imagine possible. And as the celebration continued late into that warm spring evening, marking not just the beginning of their formal union, but the dawn of genuine peace between two once bitter rivals, both of them understood that this was not truly an ending at all, but simply the beginning of everything still waiting to unfold ahead of them.